11 February 1945, Yalta. From Casablanca to Quebec, Washington, D.C. to Tehran, at points all over the globe, the leaders of the Allied powers have met throughout the course of this war to plot the destruction of Nazi tyranny in Europe. Now, with victory seemingly at hand, they meet in the Crimean city of Yalta at the former summer palace of Tsar Nicholas. Here the endgame begins in earnest. Three men, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and an ailing Franklin Roosevelt, will plot the course of the post-war world. Less united in the cause of peace than in war, each man brings his own agenda to Yalta, and each clings tenaciously to the points he considers most important. Throughout the conference, Roosevelt and Churchill focus less on seeking revenge against Germany and more on a lasting peace and a free Europe. Stalin, on the other hand, is not one to forget past transgressions. Indeed, Russia has borne a disproportionate share of suffering at the hands of Hitler's minions. He demands punishment and retribution against the Nazi state. After 7 days of intense debate, long hours of negotiation, and much give and take, the Big Three present their agreement to the world, a world that will forever be altered by the words it contains. Under the Yalta Agreement, England, the United States, and the Soviet Union pledged to help the nations liberated from Nazi domination destroy the last vestiges of Nazism and fascism, and to create democratic institutions of their own choosing. It is a high ideal, to be sure, but how it translates to fact on the ground, particularly in the East, remains to be seen. In Poland, despite vowing he will allow free and unfettered elections, Stalin already has begun to establish a communist regime to ensure that the Soviets have a strong Western neighbor that can prevent any future German incursion against Mother Russia. Stalin need not worry about Germany, however. The Yalta Agreement leaves it a hollow shell of a country controlled by the Big Three and France. The agreement gives each of the Allied nations its own zone of occupation. In addition, Germany must pay for losses she has caused the Allies in the course of the war. The bulk of these reparations will go to the countries that have borne the main burden of the war, have suffered the heaviest losses, and have organized Germany's defeat. Stalin is pleased with the reparations arrangement, as he is with the redistribution of territory both in Europe and in Asia. Throughout history, post-war maps have differed, often dramatically, from their pre-war counterparts. To Uncle Joe's delight, the post-World War II map of Europe will be no exception. After the war, Poland will no longer occupy the same coordinates that it now does. At Stalin's demand, the Yalta Agreement redraws the nation's boundaries, adding enough German land to her western frontier to make up for what Russia has grabbed from her eastern border. The Soviet Union also will receive several pieces of prime Far East real estate that Stalin has been eyeing, thereby righting the so-called wrongs committed by Japan in the 1904 war between the two nations. It is probable that history will judge Stalin to be the ultimate victor at Yalta. He seems to have come away from the table with most of his demands met. But for every Soviet victory, every U.S. and British concession, FDR and Churchill have won a point of their own. Churchill has secured distribution of power in Europe by bringing France into the occupation force, even if he and FDR had to give up parts of their own zones to do so. FDR has elicited promises of support for a United Nations organization dedicated to preserving the peace, and a first meeting of member nations on 25 April in San Francisco. He has also received Stalin's word that within 2 to 3 months of victory in Europe, the Red Army will join the U.S. and Britain in their fight against Japan. Without the Soviets' help, FDR's advisors tell him the Pacific War will last another 18 months and cost 1 million additional lives. Still, FDR has detractors at home. They say that he played fast and loose with Poland's fate, that he has been duped by Uncle Joe into making too many concessions to the Soviets, that the agreement has no means to make Stalin keep his promises. With the question of FDR's health still lingering, the most often heard criticism is that he is just too ill to have been entrusted with such a responsibility. It is likely, however, that both FDR and Churchill have made the best deal they could under the circumstances. While U.S. troops have been bogged down in the Bulge, Stalin's army has been on the move throughout Eastern Europe. The Red Army has driven the Nazis out of Yugoslavia, liberated Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, penetrated Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and is poised to enter Berlin. To remove the Soviets from Eastern Europe and deny Stalin an upper hand in Poland would mean more war, more death, more destruction. Neither the British nor the American people or their armies will tolerate much more. As Ben Franklin once said, necessity never made a good bargain. February 1945, the Philippines. Corregidor is but a barren, war-worn rock, hallowed as so many places by death and disaster. Yet it symbolizes within itself that priceless, deathless thing, the honor of a nation. Until we lift our flag from its dust, we stand unredeemed before mankind. Some 3 years after General Douglas MacArthur delivered these words, American forces are prepared to reclaim the United States' former headquarters in the Pacific. Seizing the rocky outpost at the entrance to Manila Bay will allow Allied ships to move freely and pinch off another supply route for the Japanese. But because it was the site of his ouster from the Philippines in 1942, recapturing Corregidor may have a deeper, more personal meaning for MacArthur. After days of heavy air and sea bombardment, the island fortress is ripe for an all-out attack. Shortly after dawn, in an effort to catch the Japanese off guard, C-47 Goonie Birds drop a regimental combat team of paratroopers from the 11th Airborne Division on Corregidor. Theirs is a dangerous mission. If Japanese marksmen don't shoot them out from under their silks, the stiff and ever-shifting Pacific winds threaten to carry large numbers of the paratroops to a watery grave. To lessen their time in the air and keep them from becoming floating targets for Japanese snipers, the airborne troops are dropped at an altitude far lower than any yet attempted during the war. With only 6 seconds in the air, the men in the first wave have almost no time to stabilize themselves for landing. As jumpers crash into buildings and debris or miss the zone completely, the casualty rate from the initial drop exceeds the 20% estimate of the assault's planners. The paratroops' target is topside, an elevated flat beyond Malinta Hill in Corregidor's midsection, which is heavily defended by the Japanese. On topside's three faces, the land shears away into steep cliffs above the sea. From here, the defenders could make mincemeat out of infantry, who will soon be coming ashore on the island's sandy beaches. But surprise does indeed have its rewards. Japanese defenders expected an amphibious landing, but apparently they never dreamed the American generals would be crazy enough to try an airborne assault on topside. The desperately scrambling defenders suffer a crushing blow in the first moments of attack. Drifting paratroopers accidentally land in the midst of a Japanese observation post on the cliffs. In a sudden, vicious exchange of fire, the Yanks kill the commander of the Japanese garrison along with his aides. Offshore, a contingent of cruisers and destroyers lets loose a furious barrage. This pounding is followed by bombardment from waves of Allied planes. Meanwhile, Colonel George Jones' Rock Force plows through Manila Bay toward Black Beach, a 200-yard strip on the south shore of Corregidor. 2 hours after the first paratroopers hit, 6th Army infantry begin to pour onto the beaches from landing crafts. Covering fire from the American paratroopers on topside pins the Japanese troops underground, and the first 4 waves come ashore virtually unopposed. By the time the 5th wave approaches with its complement of vehicles and heavy equipment, mines on the beach begin detonating. Still, to this point, real resistance is light, and by the time Jones's troops have taken Malinta Hill, they have lost only 2 men killed and 6 wounded. As the day wears on, however, American troops realize that they are greatly outnumbered on Corregidor. The Japanese have taken refuge from the massive air and naval bombardment in the maze of tunnels, pillboxes, and ammunition magazines that catacomb the island. Stunned defenders fight back stubbornly from their scattered caves, bunkers, and tunnels with little or no direction, and must now be rooted out of their hiding places underground. A seemingly endless series of banzai charges saps the Americans' emotional and physical strength. Casualties mount as the troops push grimly forward. Shortly after midnight, the Japanese attempt to regain Malinta Hill. Hunkered in foxholes or any small depression they can find, the Americans are subjected to an intense artillery and mortar barrage that leaves them reeling. Despite this, they rise up to meet the enemy face to face in a vicious fight. For an hour and a half, the battle rages with casualties piling up on both sides. As the assault drags on through a second hellish day, the Emperor's men refuse to loosen their grip on the island. 16 American fighter planes are shot down, trying to give cover to advancing ground troops. Additional U.S. troops stream onto the island. The Japanese, however, refuse to yield. Isolated standoffs occur throughout the day and into the night, leaving Allied forces exhausted and considerably diminished in strength. It is clear that the quick victory MacArthur and Jones had hoped for is not to be. In the light of day, the Americans are supreme, but when night falls and air support vanishes, the Japanese are in their element, forcing the GIs to pull back into easily defendable perimeters. The give and take seems certain to continue for some time, and once again this tiny, war-torn rock is the site of a pivotal battle between two determined foes. One is fighting for mere survival, the other for national honor. January 1945, eastern France. A German bridgehead near Colmar threatens the American southern flank, and with it, General Eisenhower's plan for a broad and secure crossing of the Rhine River. One of the last holdouts of German dominance west of the Rhine, this stronghold of the Nazi 19th Army is known among the Allies as the Colmar Pocket. Long ago, recognizing the pocket's strategic importance, Eisenhower ordered 6th Army General Devers to make its eradication a top priority. The Supreme Commander hoped its capture would set up a knockout blow to German industry in the Ruhr Valley and an all-out push to Berlin. No one recognizes the logic behind Eisenhower's strategy better than Adolf Hitler. The Führer has ordered the Colmar bridgehead held at all costs. The assault on Colmar begins with the African colonial troops of General de Lattre de Tassigny's French First Army leading the way. Attacking from the south, their initial progress is slow. In addition to vicious resistance and expertly laid minefields, a blistering snowstorm blinds artillery spotters and causes innumerable problems for the French African troops, who are unaccustomed to the frigid, wintry conditions. The Germans seize the opportunity and counterattack. The commander of the French First Corps asked to postpone further operations until the snowstorm subsides. De Tassigny refuses as he plans to launch his Second Corps from the north the following day. Any pause in First Corps' advance would allow the Nazis to focus all their might on the northern force. First Corps continues its tortured advance, and on 23 January, Second Corps easily achieves its objective, pushing well into the enemy's northern flank. But just as the Germans begin to show signs of vulnerability, a rapid surge in temperature melts the snow and inundates the area. Amid the flooding, the French Sherman tanks and M10 tank destroyers, superior in number but inferior in capability, become even less useful. Meanwhile, German Panthers and Jagdpanther tank destroyers, outfitted with wide tracks designed for severe weather, freely maneuver and demolish the French tanks grounded in the muddy Colmar quagmire. On 27 January, the U.S. 3rd Division joins the fray, breaking the German defenses and moving to the Colmar Canal. The German High Command, recognizing the bleakness of the situation, calls for a partial retreat across the Rhine. The Germans are reeling, and Eisenhower is determined to deliver the knockout punch. He orders the entire 21st Corps to reinforce Colmar, bringing the number of Allied troops involved in the campaign to 400,000. On 30 January, following a ferocious artillery barrage of more than 16,000 shells, the American and French forces surrounding the Germans simultaneously flood into the pocket. The U.S. 3rd Division crosses the Colmar Canal, while the 28th Division storms the city's suburbs. With victory assured, the Americans continue with simple housekeeping duties. Hitler has lost Colmar, and his generals warn that he will lose even more of his 19th Army if he doesn't order a retreat. Begrudgingly, the Führer complies and authorizes a complete pullback across the Rhine. On 9 February, the retreating 19th, licking its wounds, marches back into Germany and drops the Chalons Bridge behind them. Although they leave 22,000 POWs behind, 50,000 Germans manage to escape the carnage of Colmar, back across the Rhine. Many of those, however, wonder if their comrades in Allied POW camps aren't the lucky ones. Faced with a vengeful, bloodthirsty foe advancing from the east, resting comfortably on a Nebraska farm suddenly seems rather appealing. February 1945, Burma. In the green hell of the Burmese jungle, British troops prepare a bloody surprise for the Imperial Japanese Army. While General William Slim's 4th Corps creeps south under radio silence toward the city of Mektela, a dummy HQ to the north receives bogus orders from the British High Command to move on Mandalay. The Japanese Burma Area Army has been listening in and anticipates a massive attack on the region's major prize, Mandalay. So when the 19th Indian Division dashed across the Irrawaddy River north of that city, Burma Area Army was ready. 2 divisions of Japanese went up against what was assumed to be the spear edge of the British 4th Corps. Precious time has been ticking away for the Japanese ever since, as the Indian soldiers repelled wave after wave of enemy troops. On 21 February, another offensive thrust, this time by the British 33rd Corps, threatens Mandalay. This reinforces the Japanese belief that the ancient city is the focus of the impending Allied offensive. Imperial commanders continue to mass their forces in the area. The Japanese are so convinced by the ruse that when the main attack finally does come west of Mektela, they at first dismiss it as a diversion. After the British 7th Division secures a bridgehead over the Irrawaddy near Mektela, the 17th Indian Division breaks out toward the city across the wide-open valley that separates it from the river. Unlike much of the Burma campaign, fought in dense jungle and treacherous mountains, tanks are out in front leading the charge. The Allies also enjoy complete air superiority in the region. The few Japanese units standing between the river and the city are simply blasted out of the way. It seems nothing can go right for the Japanese High Command. Their early strategic mistakes are compounded by miscommunication, such as a garbled message that warns of 200 Allied vehicles rather than 2,000 on their way to Mektela. Only when the 17th Division approaches the city do the Japanese realize the severity of their blunder. Mektela is not only a target of opportunity, but also a vital rail link in the supply line between Rangoon and northern Burma. General Slim is hoping to choke off that lifeline, avoiding a long and costly battle for Mandalay. The veteran Indian Division makes short work of Mektela's Japanese garrison, made up almost entirely of administrative and service troops. Though they prove just as eager to die as their battle-hardened counterparts in the jungles, they are no match for Slim's men. Indian riflemen move from street to street, engaged in the all-too-familiar task of rooting out an intransigent enemy. Despite a stubborn fight, the outcome is never really in doubt. Then it is the Allies' turn to dig in as enemy troops swarm south from Mandalay to attack Mektela. General Honda's 33rd Army lays siege to the city for several weeks, throwing everything it has at the lone Indian division. The Allies hold firm, thanks in part to a steady flow of airdropped supplies. Paradoxically, Honda's troops have the 17th surrounded, but it is the Allies who hold the strategic advantage. Rail cars with Japanese reinforcements and supplies must pass through the city, and the Allies control it. The Imperial Army has played into General Slim's hands. Not only did they leave Mektela vulnerable to a quick assault, the redirection of Honda's troops has opened the door to an attack on Mandalay. The tide of war in central Burma has not simply turned. It threatens to sweep the Emperor's forces into oblivion. February 1945, Iwo Jima, in the opening act of what promises to be a day of grim drama. The big guns of the Fifth Fleet open fire on the fortifications of Iwo Jima, lumping hundreds of tons of high explosives toward the honeycomb of machine gun and mortar emplacements dotting the island. Beneath this fusillade of fire and steel, Marines from the 4th and 5th Divisions, fresh from a steak and egg breakfast, drift toward the island with orders to take it and its strategically critical airstrips. Iwo has been a thorn in the side of aerial planners since bombing raids on the Japanese homeland began. Tojo's radar capabilities on the island, situated directly between U.S. bases in the Marianas and Tokyo, have given the embattled defenders of the home island ample advance warning of impending attacks. In Japanese hands, Iwo's 2 finished airfields forced Uncle Sam's mighty B-29s to execute an excruciating dogleg around the island and to limit their bombing to high-altitude runs of limited effectiveness. With the Sulphur Island under Allied control, bomber crews could depend on fighter escorts all the way to Tokyo. Wounded B-29s would no longer have to ditch at sea. At 8:59 a.m., the first LCVP disgorges its human cargo. Finding that the water's depth quickly drops off to 12 feet or more just past the shoreline, the landing crafts pull nearly to the edge of the beach to allow the Marines safe passage. Each man carries a burden of 50 to 100 pounds, making each step a laborious task. Once on the beach, the Leathernecks find the island itself is a formidable adversary. The surface is a thick paste of gray ash into which they sink ankle-deep with each step. Amphibious tractors and Sherman tanks roll onto the beach and quickly become bogged down in the mire. Difficult tidal conditions turn the landing barges sideways as more craft accumulate behind them, including the 3rd Marine Division, which remains offshore as a floating reserve. The landing party encounters minimal resistance until it reaches the first 15-foot-high terrace at the beach's inner edge. Bursts of machine gun fire begin crisscrossing the beach. 700-pound mortar shells pock the 3,500-yard landing zone with blood-laced craters. The Japanese response builds to a ferocious crescendo. Once ashore, the Marines find 21,000 Japanese, led by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, a 5th-generation military man who has hidden his forces in a 16-mile maze of tunnels, reinforced by concrete made with the very ash that covers Iwo's surface. 600 machine gun nests overlook every square foot of the island. Kurabayashi's command post sits 75 feet underground, protected by 10 feet of reinforced concrete. The Nipponese defenders are essentially invisible to the invaders. Death rains continuously on the Marines, who look in vain for hiding places on the barren soil. Casualties mount quickly. Incoming troops compete for space on the beach, with the dead and wounded waiting evacuation amid the burning carcasses of crippled vehicles. Only sheer manpower favors the Americans, who quickly resort to grenades and flamethrowers to displace the entrenched enemy. In the absence of a battle line, everyone ashore, medical personnel, support troops, and Seabees alike, is a target. Landing craft wait offshore until the wreckage of boats destroyed in earlier waves can be cleared. In spite of the charnel house atmosphere, the Marines advance a foot at a time, burning out resistance and providing a desperately needed respite for their compatriots. The 5th Division has been charged with the task of securing Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano at the southwestern tip of the pork-chop-shaped island. It provides Kurabayashi with a vantage point over the entire battlefield. The 4th Division heads due north with orders to take the largest of the airfields, allowing Navy Seabees to render them usable to American planes. Marine Commander General Harry Schmidt and his superiors had requested 10 days of bombardment prior to the landing, but had only gotten 3 because of MacArthur's commitments in the Philippines. Now, Schmidt can only watch bitterly as the consequences of that command decision mount. By the end of the day, the Marines managed to land 30,000 able-bodied troops, cutting off Suribachi from the rest of the island and earning enough breathing space to allow the 3rd Division onto the island. For 4 days, the attackers inch forward until a detachment of the 5th Division works its way up the side of the volcano. 40 men under the command of Lieutenant Harold Schreier ascend to the mountaintop and engage the enemy. While the brief fight progresses, 6 men raise an American flag on 20 feet of discarded pipe atop the mountain. The Marines below pause from their battle momentarily to cheer. Boat horns scream. Navy Secretary James Forrestal watches from offshore and tells a companion, "The raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." February 23, 1945, Jülich, Germany. In the eerie half-light of exploding shells, American 9th and 1st Army troops burst across the Ruhr River and into the enemy's lair. As dog faces scramble across hastily built footbridges, General William Simpson's artillery unleashes a punishing attack on the stunned German defenders. Simpson has assembled an overwhelming force for Operation Grenade, which is finally underway after a 2-week wait for the flooded river to subside. The rush is now on for the GIs to connect with the British and Canadian forces of Operation Veritable, who have been busy flushing out an infestation of Nazi paratroopers in Reichswald Forest. In fact, much of the German resistance Simpson expected for his grenade assault already has been shifted north to meet the Veritable forces. At worst, the 9th Army enjoys a 5-to-1 advantage over its poorly trained and under-equipped enemy on the other side of the Ruhr. The strongest weapon in the German arsenal proves to be the river itself. The first waves of infantry cross the Ruhr and land with ease, but the river's current sends subsequent assault boats drifting far from the launch areas, leaving entire divisions temporarily stranded. The troops who do make it across find themselves slogging through mud without tank support. German gunners blast away at soldiers who try to span the Ruhr with pontoon bridges. American engineers spend treacherous hours constructing the spans under heavy fire, only to see them blown to smithereens in the end. As a result, American tank destroyers sit idle on the riverbank, away from the action. It takes almost 24 hours for the 9th to get across the Ruhr. Once across, however, the troops rip through Wehrmacht defenses like a fist through tissue paper. The Nazi opposition does less to slow them down than the devastation wrought by Allied bombers. The city of Jülich is little more than a rubble-strewn and unmanned toll booth for unit after unit of the 9th, who are now bulldozing toward their rendezvous with Operation Veritable. The 7th Corps of the 1st Army, brought up to cover the right flank of the 9th, has had the toughest job of the operation. With their own flank exposed, 1st Army's crossing of the Ruhr was a harrowing one. Now across, they push into the bridgehead city of Düren. As in Jülich, Allied bombardment has turned Düren into a moonscape of craters and rubble. Confused commanders throw away their worthless maps of the city and move street by street, ferreting out pockets of resistance. In quick measure, The bridgehead is secured and U.S. forces sweep into the nearby countryside. The Ninth Army now pivots north, and the German High Command peels forces away from Reichswald Forest to meet the new threat. The redeployment proves futile, and Simpson's forces thunder toward the Rhine. Faced with the irresistible forces of both Grenade and Veritable, German field commanders now discover to their despair that their Führer expects them to be immovable objects. Hitler will abide no retreat. In the Führer's intransigence, Simpson sees an opportunity. The American general hopes the Ninth Army can quickly hop the Rhine before Hitler comes to his senses and blows the bridges. Despite the high probability of success, however, Field Marshal Montgomery torpedoes Simpson's plan. Monty has more grandiose aspirations for a Rhine crossing, and as usual, those aspirations involve a central role for a certain British commander. Simpson contents himself by pummeling the dwindling enemy forces west of the river. The Brits and Canadians of Operation Veritable also are on the rampage, pushing the Germans into a strategic corner. Orders or no orders, the defenders of the fatherland now have only one direction to go: back across the Rhine, with their tails between their legs. February 1945, Luzon. American artillery pounds the ancient walled city of Intramuros, where the last survivors of Japan's Manila Naval Defense Force have entrenched themselves, determined to make a last stand. But the Japanese are down to their last 2,000 men here, and their attackers are looking to make Intramuros their last resting place. Since 12 February, the Emperor's warriors have fought a brutal, desperate war of attrition with the men of Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold's 14 Corps. They engaged the Americans street to street, building to building, and room to room at LaSalle University, the Manila Hotel, and other urban strongpoints. Now, whatever history they have yet the power to write will be written at Intramuros. Built by Spanish colonists in the 16th century with walls that are nearly 40 feet thick and 15 feet high, Intramuros is an imposing fortress. The infamous Santiago prison, where an estimated 5,000 Filipino civilians are held, is located within its massive walls. General Douglas MacArthur has wanted all along to avoid a bloody end to the U.S. seizure of Manila, so Griswold pleaded with Japanese forces to surrender. When no reply came, he called for this bombardment and ordered the 37th Division to prepare to attack. Over the next 5 days, American howitzers blast several openings in the once impenetrable wall. Throughout the night of 22 February, in advance of a planned infantry assault, the 14 Corps artillery maintains harassing fire against the walls and interior of Intramuros. As dawn approaches, the gunners begin laying high explosive, smoke, and white phosphorus rounds along a 100-yard strip between the east and west walls to seal off the southern third of Intramuros, preventing the Japanese in that area from observing movements to the north. The first assault is made from the sea at the north end of Intramuros. Here, direct entry to the city is accessible at the government mint. The GIs attack from the north bank of the Pasig River, supported by artillery and armor. Heavy artillery fire supports a simultaneous Allied assault at Quezon Gate, a point near the northeastern entrance of Intramuros. As the 37th storms into the walled city, the enemy offers only scattered resistance from isolated machine gun and rifle positions. The Japanese have retired into a few undamaged buildings as well as into tunnels and holes. They have a considerable battery of arms and ammunition, but no coordinated defense. One by one, the Americans reduce the separate enemy strongpoints with fragmentation and white phosphorus grenades, demolitions, bazookas, and flamethrowers. As the U.S. attack moves forward, the Japanese begin releasing civilian hostages from the walled city in small groups. Most of those freed are women, children, and some Roman Catholic nuns and priests. Nearly all of the male civilians had been murdered in Fort Santiago's dungeons long before Allied forces returned to the island. By morning on 24 February, the 37th Division has contained the last of the Japanese resistance in the Aquarium, located in a bunker off the southwest corner of Intramuros. An American unit discovers an undefended tunnel connecting the bunker to the main wall and uses it as an assault route, while the rest of the battalion provides fire support. Spreading grenades and bazooka fire ahead of them, the Americans break into the Aquarium with little trouble. An hour and a half and 115 dead Japanese later, the last organized resistance within the walled city has been neutralized. After 6 brutal days, what's left of Intramuros is in American hands. Thousands of corpses litter the streets. The city itself has been almost completely destroyed, and so has General MacArthur's dream of taking the Pearl of the Orient intact. Amid the unspeakable carnage and unending terror of the greatest war in human history, there are men in uniform who never fire a weapon or attack an enemy. They serve stoically on the battlefields, facing the same specter of death and capture that menaces their gun-bearing comrades, armed only with the fragile symbols of their merciful offices, protected only by the abstract umbrella of a set of rules outlined in the Geneva Conventions. These are the military chaplains and medical personnel who risk their lives, their faiths, and their liberty, protecting the spiritual and physical well-being of the fighting boys on the front lines. Crucial to any unit, medical corpsmen care for ailments ranging from the common cold to trench foot to the horrible wounds incurred in battle. They sometimes take ribbing from their fellows as glorified pill rollers, but when battle rages and the cry goes up for medic, no one doubts the courage of these men under fire. Alongside the medic, there is often a chaplain sharing the grim work of caring for the wounded, and to him falls the sorrowful yet necessary task of administering last rites and comforting the dying. The debt owed to chaplains by grieving families and comrades is undeniable. It is often the chaplain who catches the last words of a fallen Joe, collects his personal effects, presides over his burial, and writes letters to his family. In the chaotic maelstrom of pitched battle, trusting in a flimsy red patch for preservation is perhaps a greater act of courage than charging a machine gun nest with guns ablaze. But implacable medics, litter bearers, and chaplains work their way among the fallen, perhaps obscured in dust and smoke, enveloped in the deafening roar of artillery and gunfire, attempting to dispense hope and comfort while not becoming casualties themselves. Frequently, they are not so lucky. Though signatories of the Geneva Convention are pledged to respect the medical and religious personnel of all belligerents, mistakes in the heat of battle are almost unavoidable. For that reason, the red cross worn on the helmet is viewed by some as both blessing and curse. The symbol that is supposed to protect also identifies, and stories abound of medics who are targeted by snipers, prompting gallows humorists to call the crosses aiming stakes. Occasionally, ambulances and field hospitals, though clearly marked, come under bombing and strafing attacks. Such occurrences are usually blamed on miscalculation, but the victims are always left with the suspicion of intent and the temptation to avenge. Nowhere are the rules of war more callously disregarded than in the Pacific Theater. Japanese brutality has been well documented since the infamous Bataan Death March of 1942, during which Allied prisoners were beaten, starved, and beheaded on their way to prison camps. Unbound by the Geneva Convention, which Japan never signed, Japanese soldiers routinely kill Allied wounded, torture prisoners, and mutilate the dead. Neither medics nor chaplains are in the least exempt from attack, and are often repaid in treachery for their compassionate attempts to help a wounded enemy. It is the complex nature of war that elicits both stories of atrocity and incredible tales of cooperation and mercy between belligerents. Medical truces sometimes allow medics to remove suffering victims from the hot zones between the lines without fear of being fired upon. And it is not unheard of for the medical staffs of opposing armies to work side by side in caring for and evacuating the wounded to aid stations when battle casualties are particularly heavy. The exigencies of war also allow for cooperation between religious faiths. It is not always possible for each faith to be represented in a single unit or sector of the front. Therefore, rabbis may sometimes include Christian Easter symbolism in their Passover sermons, or a Baptist preacher may find himself leading a Rosh Hashanah service in the South Pacific. Priests, rabbis, and Protestant ministers work selflessly to bring comfort to soldiers who may be shattered in body, mind, or spirit. From makeshift chapels in bombed-out churches and barns to hedgerows and tropical jungles, our troops overseas look to these men of God to bring messages of love and hope into a savage landscape. Dedicated medics and chaplains serving overseas deserve our thanks for their many sacrifices. But perhaps their greatest contribution lies in bringing whatever still exists of mercy, civility, and the promise of peace to a world wrecked by the violence of war. February 1945, Iwo Jima. The stars and stripes waving above Mount Suribachi are deceptive in their suggestion that this tiny lump of lava rests in American hands. At ground level, Marines and Japanese regulars still contest nearly three-quarters of the ash-covered island with its Spartan airstrips as the prize. Backed by airstrikes from offshore carriers and from elements of the 7th Air Force flying out of Guam, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions claw their way northeast, prying loose Japanese defenders firing from caves and concrete bunkers. The 5th Marines already have given the Allies a crucial assist by taking Suribachi. Because Commander Tadamichi Kurebayashi and his men no longer have an unobstructed view of the entire island, the Leathernecks are able to move more quickly and more safely. The Japanese, however, have hardly capitulated. Marine commanders are well aware that the Emperor's fighters are prepared to make their stand on this desolate landscape. At issue on this day of fighting are Hills 362A and 382, which flank the eastern end of Iwo's largest airstrip in the center of the island. As they are the only other elevated areas on Iwo, the Marines covet the vantage point they offer. That perch, however, will come at a high price. Bullets and shells are still largely useless against the enemy, who have turned Iwo into a virtual ant farm of reinforced tunnels. Grenades, flamethrowers, and satchel charges are weapons of necessity in this battle. Japanese troops manning machine gun and mortar positions are incinerated or blown to bits as the 3 Marine divisions slowly but surely press ahead. The 3rd Division and its Sherman tank complement are most vulnerable to attack as they crawl north through the island's central valley. The 5th Marines on their northern flank and the 4th to the south must advance foot by punishing foot up hillsides laced with barbed wire, booby traps, and snipers. Without their protection, the 3rd Marines, armor and all, would be just so many fish in a barrel. The Japanese also have an armor presence on Iwo, but even that has been incorporated into the natural defenses of the island. Under the direction of Baron Takeichi Nishi, an Olympic equestrian champion turned warrior, Nipponese tanks are buried to their turrets and used as protected stationary guns. The Marines commander, General Harry Schmidt, had predicted that Iwo would fall to the Allies in 10 days. With only 2 days remaining on the timetable, there is no chance that this will happen. The fighting remains savage, and U.S. casualties already have topped 8,000. Offshore, 4 landing craft equipped for emergency surgery await the call to transport the wounded back to the hospital ships Samaritan and Solace. Another landing craft serves as a floating blood bank, bringing whole blood to the field hospitals barely out of mortar range. Through it all, the Marines press forward, fighting off the stench of brimstone, a maddening infestation of sand fleas, and the maniacal Japanese defenders. The 3rd Division manages to break a major line of resistance northeast of the airfield before nightfall. Although it is a huge step forward, much work remains to be done. Pitched battles lie ahead on this hilly, sandy terrain where each step is an exhausting, dangerous ordeal. On this day, however, the Americans on Iwo begin to feel as they did the day they watched the Stars and Stripes raised on Suribachi's peak. Somehow, through all the sand and smoke and blood, this island may yet be theirs for the taking. The job of the scout, as described in Army manuals, is to provide fresh, detailed, accurate information on enemy forces to prevent surprise. Through history, scouting or reconnaissance has been carried out in a number of ways by men and animals. With the invention of mechanized warfare, this task has been assumed by a combination of naval, aerial, and ground units. Since the beginning of the war, the Navy has used a variety of vessels to accomplish reconnaissance. Fast-moving PT boats prove their worth time and again in the Philippines and South Pacific. They move quickly and stealthily through the narrow waterways and inlets assigned them, gathering information about the disposition of Japanese defenses. Submarines prove useful for getting deep behind enemy lines to gather important data on the composition of enemy forces, to take photographs, and to act as spotters for invading forces. In the air, naval patrol bombers of the PBY Catalina and Martin Mariner types, previously used for rescuing men and delivering supplies, have become the long-range eyes of the Navy. It was a Catalina that spotted the Japanese carrier force at Midway, leading to that great victory. Smaller scout planes, such as the Seagull, Kingfisher, and Seahawk, serve as artillery spotters for naval gunners lending fire support or engaging surface ships. The Army adopted this method in Sicily, using small L-5 Sentinel liaison aircraft as spotters. These planes flew from modified freighters turned into carriers for the invasion to act as the eyes of the landing Allied army, pointing out enemy defenses waiting on the beach. The Army Air Forces are also assigned the task of securing information from the air through photographic or visual means. To this end, the service has employed a number of planes as scouts, from special reconnaissance aircraft such as the P-38 Snoop Droop to heavy bombers like the B-29. On a daily basis, these aircraft fly over the continent of Europe and the vast expanses of the Pacific, taking pictures of an unsuspecting enemy. The photographs are taken back to airfields where they are quickly developed and passed to Allied commanders, who use the information to plan raids deep into the enemy's territory. Details such as the number of anti-aircraft guns, fighters, and fortified emplacements are noted and planned for. Targets are picked out and assigned to various squadrons. Navigators are familiarized with destinations, and bombardiers provided with reference points for bomb runs. After the raid, more reconnaissance planes fly in to determine the success of the attack and whether new strikes need to be planned. With the fluid motion of battle lines and sometimes impassable terrain, new ways have been developed to employ reconnaissance aircraft. The Office of Strategic Services designed a system for using light scout aircraft launched from a cable suspended in the air. A 9-man crew is either parachuted or sent by truck behind enemy lines into an area where it is otherwise impractical to build an airfield. When they reach their objective, they quickly deploy a series of poles and string a suspended cable. This allows the light aircraft to be captured in mid-air. The pilot then passes on information or receives information, climbs back into his plane, is relaunched in slingshot fashion. On the ground, the Army, too, has its own specialized reconnaissance forces. In the age of mechanized warfare, armored vehicles now do the jobs once done by horses. Self-propelled howitzers, half-tracks, light tanks, and armored cars go places never dreamed of by the cavalrymen of old. Lightly armed and designed for maneuverability, these units most frequently are employed in a tactic known as the smother approach. In this maneuver, most common on the Western Front, armored cars dash up to the enemy lines en masse, probing for weak spots. Russian generals still prefer to depend on their infantrymen to be their army's eyes and ears on the battlefield. That is why they still most often use the sneak approach to reconnaissance, sending small groups of soldiers behind enemy lines to gather information and return. While modern war may give us still more innovations as yet undreamed of, it is doubtful that any will replace the common soldier. To March 1945, Trier, Germany. This ancient city stands before General George Patton like a tantalizing jewel. But its Nazi artillery, pillboxes, and anti-tank defenses have kept him from seizing it. Until now. Eager to follow in the footsteps of Caesar, Patton tried capturing the former Roman outpost in October, but fell short of the Siegfried Line. The general blamed that failure on a lack of manpower and resolved not to be caught thus short again. Now that the Siegfried has since been breached just north of the city, nothing is going to stop him, not even his own superiors. To boost the might of his Third Army, Patton requested from Schaeff an extra armored division on the grounds he needed it to clear the Germans from the Saar-Moselle Triangle west of the Rhine. True to his word, he deployed his new division to the task immediately. But though the tankers cleared the Saar-Moselle in short order, Patton forgot to give them back to Schaeff. Instead, he immediately incorporated them into Third Army's all-out assault on Trier. Patton has used this method to squeeze supplies and reinforcements out of the Allied command since late 1944, when he was often desperate for resources. It is a simple but effective strategy. He asks for whatever troops Eisenhower will give him, commits them so they can't be returned, then uses them to advance his own agenda. General Omar Bradley is the reluctant buffer between Schaeff and the maverick general. Luckily for Patton, Bradley has a similarly aggressive agenda, one with its origins in the Battle of the Bulge. Since the U.S. Army took a black eye in the Ardennes months before, Bradley has been looking for any and every opportunity to restore its reputation. He is betting on Patton and Third Army to do great things, and, like it or not, their compass is pointing to Trier. When Schaeff calls to ask about its missing division, Bradley simply avoids the telephone. Patton's window of opportunity has arrived. He throws the bulk of his forces at the city's outer defenses like a battering ram. As the German gunners struggle to fend off the main threat, a battalion of armored infantry from the 10th Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jack Richardson, swings northeast to enter the city on a secondary road. Richardson's men rumble into Trier undetected and smother a German artillery company before they can fire a single shot. Having accomplished his primary objective without breaking a sweat, Richardson learns there are 2 bridges for the taking if he can get to them in time. He splits his battalion in 2 and marches on both. One is, in fact, discovered intact, and it is all Patton needs to take his army over the Moselle. 2 divisions swarm into the city, capturing hundreds of bleary-eyed German soldiers as they roll out of bed. The linchpin of the Saar-Moselle Triangle is now in American hands. Soon after, General Patton receives 2 urgent messages at his headquarters almost simultaneously. The first is the news that Trier has been taken. The second is from Schaeff, asking him to bypass the city and return his borrowed division. The Allied command insists Trier cannot be taken with less than 4 divisions. Patton sends a terse, sarcastic response asking Schaeff if they want him to give the city back to the Germans. The conquest of Chir has validated Patton's methods in particular, and has helped to vindicate the U.S. Army as a whole. The German frontier is now wide open to the tanks of the Third Army, but now a new, more daunting obstacle looms on the horizon: the Rhine. February 26, 1945, the Philippines. The progress of the American invasion of Corregidor has exceeded expectations. The Japanese force, leaderless since the first hours of the assault, has gone to ground and continues to fight savagely and sporadically from its scattered caves, bunkers, and tunnels. The Rock Force, combined elements of the 6th Army and the 11th Airborne Division under the command of Colonel George Jones, took Malinta Hill and Topside, the high ground of this stony fortress at Manila Bay, early in the fighting. But now they must root out the defenders from their subterranean hiding places. A week of mopping up action has focused on just that, but the enemy refuses to surrender even when death is inevitable. Fanatically devoted to their emperor and sworn to give their all, they are content to make their graves on or beneath Corregidor. American troops now deal death in a chilling variety of ways as they go about the destruction of Japanese strongholds. What naval bombardment cannot reach, napalm incinerates from above. What howitzers, rifles, and machine guns cannot blast away, white phosphorus grenades and flamethrowers burn to cinders. When it is clear the remaining defenders cannot be induced to leave their caves, U.S. engineers seal the entrances with blasts that entomb the holdouts in mausoleums of charred, jagged rock. But nothing the Americans devise can compete with the fantastic death dramas the Japanese orchestrate for themselves. Even though tremors from underground explosions have shaken them for days, the men of Rock Force are not prepared for the devastating blast at Monkey Point on 26 February. Whether by accident or design, the enemy blows an underground arsenal, hurling debris from one end of the island to the other, and almost a mile out to sea. The bodies of Japanese and American soldiers lie everywhere, twisted and torn apart, creating for already overworked medics even more gruesome work, clearing up the remains and giving treatment to those lucky enough to survive. No organized resistance remains on Corregidor, but in the presence of so much death, the American triumph will go largely uncelebrated. Uncelebrated, that is, except by General Douglas MacArthur. The stain on his record expunged, General MacArthur visits the island on 2 March. With the fall of Manila imminent, Corregidor's recapture places the cork in the Manila Bay bottle. Seeing the flagpole intact, MacArthur rises to the occasion. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever hold them down. There's an old saying in the Army, you never have the right piece of equipment when you need it. And whenever there's an equipment shortage, it's the boys in the foxholes who suffer the consequences. The right piece of equipment is anything that can stop the shivering and protect the feet. But even in warmer weather, life in the foxhole is miserable. 2 men live cramped together, sometimes for a month or more, in a hole typically 3 to 4 feet deep and 6 by 2 feet wide. The endless hours of boredom stretch into endless days, leaving endless time for thinking and for being lonely, for realizing there is no future, only survival. Buddies talk about their homes, their families, their wives and girlfriends. Each becomes intimately familiar with the other's history, especially his love life. But as with married couples, intimacy can also bring annoyances, like that irritating humming, those aggravating coughs. Even the way he sleeps can drive you crazy. But there is little sleeping done in the foxhole. There can be ominous silence, followed by the sudden unknown sound. Is it one of your own men or a German patrol trying to sneak past? Should you fire at it, or will that give away your own position to enemy fire? Men try to stay alert, often on only 2 hours of sleep. The boredom can be relieved at any time by the terror and destruction of shelling. A tremendous bang can mean the guys in the next hole are gone, or it can mean a sudden shower of shattered limbs and tree trunks. The open foxhole provides no protection when these knives, needles, and razor blades rain from the skies. Winter only adds to this misery. This year, sub-zero temperatures have been accompanied by stiff winds, snow, and a penetrating damp fog. Until warmer clothing arrives, soldiers wear anything and everything they can to stay warm. When the temperature climbs above freezing, troops often find their leather combat boots are almost worse than useless. They don't keep your feet dry, which is a big problem when you are standing in several inches of water. British and Russian troops are better trained to cope with this problem because of lessons their armies learned during the trench warfare of World War I. The British soldiers have gum-soled boots that they are required to keep waxed. They massage their feet often with oil and change frequently into dry socks. The Russians, thanks to long experience fighting in snowy climes, also have effective cold weather gear and daily regimens for the care of their feet. But the Americans entered World War I late and failed to learn the same lessons. So it is that in this war, the malady known as trench foot soon causes almost as many casualties among the Yanks as do the Germans. When feet stay cold and damp for a long time, circulation slows or stops. Feet turn white and numb. If the soldier fails to get proper care, gangrene can set in, and amputation is the only solution. When the number of trench foot cases among U.S. troops climbs into the thousands, commanders begin ordering soldiers to massage their feet and change their socks daily. Dry socks are issued with rations. Some officers even threaten their subordinates with courts-martial if they succumb to trench foot. A better solution is out there. The American Army's Shoe Pack, an improved boot that features synthetic rubber that covers most of the foot, topped by calf-high leather. 2 heavy pairs of socks come with them. Tested in the Aleutians, the shoe packs are proven to keep feet warm and dry even under severe conditions. But because the American High Command believed the war would be over at Christmas, most of the shoe packs, as well as the warmer clothes, sit in huge stacks on U.S. docks. For March 1945 Iwo Jima, the Marines laying siege to this volcanic hellhole have devised their own nicknames for places on the island that their superiors have designated for conquest. Nondescript official names like Hill 362 have been replaced with more colorful monikers, like Turkey Knob or the Meat Grinder or the Amphitheater. No matter what the terminology, however, each natural feature of this foul-smelling speck in the Pacific has its own set of dangers awaiting the unwary GI. For their part, the hopelessly outnumbered Japanese know they cannot expect an 11th-hour rescue. With the Imperial Air Force all but eliminated in the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and most of the Japanese Navy resting on the ocean floor, the minions of the rising sun have no honorable choice but to defend their positions to the death. The last of the Japanese armor was lost on 28 February, as Baron Takeichi Nishi's remaining 8 tanks broke cover in a pitched battle with elements of the 3rd Marine Division, knifing up Iwo's center. Nishi's remaining troops now fight from bunkers and caves, bedeviling the Leathernecks with surprise attacks and booby traps. The 4th Marine Division is fighting at only half of combat strength, but pushes forward with grenades and flamethrowers in an effort to quell the savage resistance. In 3 days of fighting, one American company loses 6 commanding officers. Some companies are so decimated that they are consolidated with other equally battered units. These patchwork units press on, fighting sun, sand, and insects, along with the Japanese, and enduring one grueling ordeal after another in pursuit of their objective. Across the island, the Americans are confronted with grim reminders of the Japanese will to resist. The abandoned command posts of the retreating enemy must be approached warily for fear of explosives left behind in parting. Even the few living Imperial troops discovered by the Allies are checked from a distance for telltale wires that indicate a booby trap. The Japanese leave nothing else of value behind. The day also sees an unexpected reminder of the strategic value of the minuscule outpost. An offshore radio base picks up a distress call from a B-29 bomber suffering a fuel leak. Short of ditching the plane, the crew's only option is to put down on Iwo. After brief deliberations, the superfortress swoops around Mount Suribachi and onto the south runway of Airstrip Number 1. Amid constant mortar fire, Navy mechanics scramble to repair the B-29's faulty fuel pump. A few hours later, the mighty bomber is again airborne, the first of what Navy officials expect to become a regular event on this sulfurous chunk of rock. The taking of the last major hill on Iwo effectively eliminates any lingering doubt about the outcome of this mission. Lacking a vantage point from which to observe Allied movements, and without the manpower or firepower to launch a counterstrike, the Japanese must now accept the inevitability of losing Iwo to the Americans. Sadly, however, it is equally inevitable that the remaining defenders will resist to the death. Even as the airfields are refitted for their new role as way stations for American air power, Uncle Sam's Marines brace themselves for the long, difficult, and bloody task of securing the remainder of the island. 6 March 1945, Berlin. Adolf Hitler, who so recently lorded over Europe like a heavyweight champion, now reels from the pummeling of his enemies like a punch-drunk amateur, reduced to throwing ineffectual local counterpunches. But defense has never been de Fuhrer's strong suit. He orders what is likely to be his last major offensive in Hungary. As usual, his goals are as grandiose as his resources are paltry. Hitler orders 22 divisions to attack eastward from the area north and south of Lake Balaton and make for the Danube. Their mission? To encircle and destroy the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front. As he did with his failed Ardennes offensive, Hitler sets the ultimate goal of this attack far beyond any reasonable expectation of success. He orders his diminished divisions to smash an entire Soviet army group, and then drive to Romania and retake the oil fields at Ploiești. To lead Germany's last forlorn hope, codenamed Spring Awakening, Hitler promotes General Otto Wehler to Commander Army Group South. The main striking force, the 6th SS Panzer Army, will be led by an old Führer favorite, the stalwart SS General Josef Sepp Dietrich. German infrastructure is in such disarray that it has taken Dietrich 6 weeks of arduous travel from his Ardennes command to take up his new posting in Hungary. Nonetheless, the offensive starts on time and it immediately runs into trouble. In the marshy area around Lake Balaton, Dietrich's panzers, counting on frozen solid ground, find that an early thaw has turned the area into a morass. To make matters worse, a few local counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads merely alert 3rd Ukrainian Front Commander Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin to the presence of SS troops. At this late stage of the war, the Russians know large numbers of Hitler's elite are a sure sign that a German attack is on the way. Tolbukhin wastes no time in readying an appropriate reception for the Wehrmacht, mining roads and positioning anti-tank weapons in depth along the Nazi routes of advance. The Germans make some small gains, but inclement weather and wily Soviet commanders contain Spring Awakening before it has a chance to fully develop. On 16 March, the Russians launch their counteroffensive. German troops, exhausted and grossly overextended, lose their famed resiliency as soldiers. They now truly believe the war is lost and simply refuse to fight or follow orders. Perhaps this last lunge of the Wehrmacht has produced some ancillary benefits after all. Spring Awakening has opened the heretofore closed eyes of Hitler's select troops. Now the name of the game is simple. Survive. Survive to retreat. Retreat to surrender. Surrender to the West. February 1945, Luzon, the Philippines. 3 weeks after American troops first pushed across the city limits on 3 February, the savage, no-holds-barred fight for Manila continues to rage. Relentless building-to-building and room-to-room fighting, along with constant pounding by artillery and mortars, has turned the Pearl of the Orient into the armpit of the earth. Endless blocks of homes are in ruins. Most buildings are destroyed. Clearing Manila of the Japanese has proven far more difficult and costly for U.S. forces than their spectacular initial rush promised. And it is horrendously different from the triumphant victory parade General Douglas MacArthur had envisioned. While elements of the 37th Division have been clearing the walled city of Intramuros, other troops of that division, with some help from the 1st Cavalry Brigade, have been pounding away at the Japanese occupying Manila's government buildings and her South Port area. There are relatively few Imperial troops left to hold the South Port, but they are well placed and dug in, and they managed to hold out for 2 days. After hours of constant mortar and small arms fire, some 250 Japanese soldiers do the unthinkable. They surrender. On 24 February, the American cavalrymen make short work of the holdouts and secure Southport the next day. But the action at the government district is a different story. Initially, the strength of the Japanese garrison is unknown. A combined assault force bombards the buildings point blank with howitzers, tank guns, and mortars. On the morning of 26 February, after the building's defenses have been softened up by the bombardments, the 1st Infantrymen of the 37th enter and meet stiff resistance at the Legislative Building. Meanwhile, the 5th Cavalry tries to enter the Agriculture Building, but Japanese fire from nearby forces them to break off their attack and seek cover. Repeated assaults are attempted over the next 2 days, but to no avail. The enemy holds on tenaciously. Finally, on 1st March, after appealing unsuccessfully to the remaining defenders to surrender, the Americans used demolitions and gasoline to burn out the last Japanese soldiers in the building. Throughout the city, the sheer weight of American firepower begins to take its toll, and Japanese defenses begin to crumble. Several small groups of Japanese soldiers surrender over the next 48 hours. As word spreads that the defense of the Agriculture Building has failed, the last Japanese troops lay down their arms on 3 March. At last, Manila is retaken, but the cost has been terrible. 14 Corps has lost over 1,000 men killed and more than 5,500 wounded during the month of fighting. More than 16,000 Japanese have sacrificed their lives for their emperor, and ultimately for nothing. Few civilian populations anywhere have endured more intense horrors than Manila's. More than 100,000 Filipinos in the capital are dead, either caught in the crossfire or murdered by the doomed Japanese garrison. On 27 February, General Douglas MacArthur makes his way through this scene of utter destruction and violence to Malacañang Palace. Here, on behalf of the United States government, the general returns constitutional power of the Commonwealth to President Osmeña and the Filipino people. Your capital city, cruelly punished though it be, has regained its rightful place, says MacArthur, citadel of democracy in the East. 5 March 1945, Cologne. After enduring numerous waves of Allied air raids, what remains of Germany's fourth largest city smolders on the edge of the Rhine, the great western barrier to enemies of the Reich. Unfortunately for the city's beleaguered residents, they are afforded no such protection as Cologne is on the west bank of the Rhine. Now General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army, has the city in his sights. He dispatches General Lightning Joe Collins, commander of 7th Corps, to put the bomb-pocked Berg out of its misery once and for all. The capture of Cologne will put an exclamation point at the end of Operation Lumberjack, the code name for 12th Army Group's push to the Rhine. 7th Corps has been the workhorse of Lumberjack, covering the 9th Army's flank as it plowed northeast in Operation Grenade. Now the 9th is safely in position along the Rhine, and Collins' troops have switched from defense to offense, stabbing southward into the toothless maw of the enemy. Allied command had expected Cologne to be a tough nut to crack, but after many punishing weeks west of the Rhine, the German army is on the ropes. Hitler orders counterattack after counterattack, turning a blind eye to the hopelessness of the situation. His generals obediently prepare strategies to thwart the Allied advance, but they know the plans are little more than fiction for their Führer's consumption. On the real-life battlefield, only two options remain: speedy withdrawal or annihilation. With Allied planes darkening the skies and Sherman tanks around every corner, Wehrmacht commanders have no choice but to retract their threadbare divisions across the Drink. A token force of the untrained and the unfortunate are left behind. General Friedrich Kirchling's 133rd Corps has drawn the short straw to defend Cologne. He spreads the vestiges of 3 divisions in a thin outer ring, leaving the interior to the befuddled townsfolk. Fritz the fireman and Gustav the gardener may not know bazookas from bratwurst, but they meet the Reich's current requirements for soldiers. They have a pulse and know how to surrender. These are the men of the Volkssturm, Hitler's jerry-built army of juveniles and geriatrics, in reality, nothing more than townspeople in uniform. The battle-hardened troops outside the city are altogether another matter. The dwindling ranks of the 9th Panzer Division still have some fight left in them. General Maurice Rose's 3rd Armored Division, pushing to Cologne from the north, is discovering that German steel makes for the worst kind of speed bump. For all its tenacity, however, the 9th Division ends up as so many flaming panzer patties. On the city's southern edge, the story is much the same. The American 8th Division must weave its way around coal mines and panzer fire, but ultimately overwhelms the Germans. In all, the fighting outside Cologne takes less than a day. Then 3 American divisions swarm toward the city's center. Tearing through the feeble resistance, the GIs suddenly stumbled upon a nasty surprise. More than a dozen German artillery pieces are leveled against Allied armor with deadly effectiveness. The GI tankers react quickly enough to nip this problem in the bud, charging the big stationary guns from behind a wall of smoke. Soon all organized resistance crumbles and American forces envelop the city. Tanks stream through the ruins of Cologne towards Hohenzollern Bridge, hoping their lightning assault has given the Germans no time to destroy it. They needn't have hurried. The bridge is now a pile of twisted steel and brick, much like the rest of the city. Up and down the river, in fact, bridges are being blown to smithereens as the Wehrmacht makes its belated withdrawal. If the Allies want to get to eastern Germany, it seems there will be no escaping the cold waters of the Rhine. With Operation Lumberjack complete and Cologne in Allied hands, First Army is well ahead of schedule. An intact bridge would have been a coup, but it was never part of the plan. However, as events unfold in a nearby town named Remagen, Allied commanders are about to discover that plans change. War. Was there ever a more full-time job? Was there ever any human endeavor that so saturated the lives of its participants? Is there any activity of mud and blood that allows one less time to sit, less time to relax, less time to let the mind wander? And yet, even in war, there are fallow moments. Moments when, perhaps against one's will and better judgment, thoughts drift. With all that has passed before, and all that has yet to come, some things are now and shall remain the same as they were. March 1945, Tokyo, a maelstrom of fire engulfs this capital city as U.S. bombers successfully carry out their first ever low-altitude incendiary bombing of the heart of the Japanese Empire. Major General Curtis LeMay and his bomber crews have reduced a quarter of Tokyo to ashes, thanks to an innovative change of tactics. Over the past months, LeMay has been looking for ways to improve the effectiveness of American bombers in the Pacific. The precision bombing of specific strategic targets was disappointing at best, and the High Command demanded more strikes against Japan. The success of the 11 December incendiary bombing of Hankow, China, suggested to LeMay that the technique might be used with equal effectiveness in Japan. Incendiary bombs require less accuracy and do more damage than conventional bombs. The British and the Germans embraced this strategy earlier with devastating effect in Europe, but the Americans, unwilling to deliberately attack innocent civilians, have persisted in targeting only strategic military sites. LeMay tested his idea in February with high-altitude bombings of Tokyo and her sister city of Kobe. Using only incendiary bombs, LeMay's B-29s destroyed a significant number of factories in Kobe and roughly 1 square mile of Tokyo. But high-altitude bombings in daylight are problematic. Visibility makes it easier for Japanese fighter planes to pursue and harass the superforts. Japanese defenses are less effective at night, so LeMay orders another bombing run on Tokyo, this time at night and at low altitudes to get below the cloud ceiling. The general judges the risk from Japanese anti-aircraft guns to be acceptable. The B-29s were stripped of their machine guns, ammunition, and extra personnel to allow them to carry heavier bomb loads. 343 of the bombers take off from the Marianas and head to Tokyo. Within a few short hours, the B-29s rain a devastating hail of fire, terror, and death on Tokyo, taking the Japanese completely by surprise. Napalm-filled bombs ignite a 16-square-mile area of Tokyo that is 4 times more densely populated than most American cities. The flames quickly engulf the traditional Japanese wood and paper homes. The Tokyo Fire Department, poorly equipped and undermanned, cannot begin to respond. A stiff wind, estimated later to be 55 miles an hour, whips the flames into immense firestorms of up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Superheated vapors advance ahead of the flames, sucking up oxygen and spreading carbon monoxide along with unimaginable heat. Death comes quickly and in several ways: incineration, suffocation, and trampling by stampeding crowds of civilians. Afterwards, official U.S. estimates put the death toll at more than 83,000 Japanese, with about 41,000 injured and 267,000 structures destroyed. Other sources claim even higher figures, perhaps as many as 120,000 Japanese killed and more than 1 million people left homeless. In contrast, of the striking force responsible, only 14 bombers are lost. It is a dramatic and successful change in U.S. tactics. Very quickly, LeMay plans more attacks. He now has what he believes is the blueprint for a blazing defeat for the Empire of the Rising Sun. March 1945, Koblenz. For the doomed Germans west of the Rhine River, the wolves are scratching at the door. The sound is distinctly similar to that of American tank engines, and it's coming from every direction. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of the Allied forces, knows the Rhine is the last major barrier between his armies and Der Führer's doorstep. As he prepares to send his troops across, he is perplexed by the deployment of enemy forces. Instead of pulling back to the east side of the river, where they might make a more formidable defense against the Allied advance, the Germans hold stubbornly to their emplacements west of the river. Whatever their reasons, Ike is determined to exploit their stupidity. Waffen-SS General Paul Heuser, the man charged with defending the area, would agree with Eisenhower's assessment, but there is little he can do about it. He has pleaded with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to be allowed to withdraw and defend the far bank of the Rhine, but to no avail. Retreat, von Rundstedt tells him, is not allowed. Heuser is resigned to his fate. He knows Rundstedt is merely parroting Hitler's insane edict, but that won't make it any easier for him to hold the line against the American 3rd and 7th Armies. He is all too aware his position is weak, and he knows the Allies know it too. General George Patton sees the German line has been stretched to the breaking point and concludes he can plow through it immediately. To the south, General Alexander Patch takes a more cautious approach, choosing to wait for more supplies and better integration of his troops. Both Patton and his direct superior, Omar Bradley, are perfectly happy to get the Third Army off to a head start. Both are chafing to begin clearing the Germans from the region, and both have their eyes on the Rhine. They hope to get across it before their rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, launches his assault to the north. Despite the depleted state of the German army, the road to the Rhine is forbidding. Scrambling German units have already reduced muddy roadways to slop, and the steep, wooded hills have restricted Patton to narrow fronts. The scattered pockets of enemy troops fight desperately, but ultimately can offer only token resistance as Patton's men throw down pontoon bridges on the Moselle River near Koblenz. The Third Army's 12 Corps rumbles southward to the Nahe River, as 20 Corps smashes through the Siegfried Line and swings eastward. For a few days, the weather clears, allowing Allied fighter bombers to fill the spring skies with ordnance, pounding the Germans from above while the land assault intensifies. By the time the 7th Army begins its thrust from the south on 15 March, the Wehrmacht is battered and on the run. The enemy's problem is there is nowhere to run. The logical path across the Rhine is forbidden. The Germans are trapped. The roads are littered with their dead and with smoldering heaps of metal, and still the U.S. Army Air Corps rains fire and death on them from above, unchecked. By now, Hitler has removed Rundstedt as Western Front commander and appointed Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Kesselring's first general order to his field commanders drips with hidden meaning. They are to hold their positions, he says, but they must avoid encirclement. Of course, the only way for them to avoid encirclement is to run like hell. The very same day, 17 March, Ike meets with his generals and gives Patton the go-ahead to push his army as fast as it will go, squeezing the Germans against the approaching 7th Army. The Third Army moves through the German countryside like a green tornado, crushing everything in its path. Within days, most of the German forces still west of the Rhine are encircled and annihilated. The Third Army alone captures or kills 113,000 enemy soldiers. According to Allied estimates, the two German armies defending the Rhine have lost 75 to 80% of their infantry. Patton is now on the west bank of the Great River, dipping his toes in the water, as his ally to the north, Field Marshal Montgomery, prepares to leap across. March 1945, the Philippines. The ruined but newly liberated city of Manila struggles back to life. But General Shitsuo Yokoyama's Shimbu Group still controls vital water supplies in the rugged foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains northeast of the city. American forces, already stretched to the limit, now must secure both the Wawa and Ipoh dams, even as they continue mopping up operations on the southern coast of Luzon. General Douglas MacArthur's continuing campaigns in the southern islands have further depleted U.S. strength around the capital. But 6th Army Commander General Walter Kruger must play the hand he has been dealt. On 12 March, he launches an attack toward the Wawa Dam from the Marikina Valley, pushing north and east against the Shimbu defense. The rough terrain is pitted with natural caves that the Japanese have craftily camouflaged and connected by tunnels. The best efforts of American air and artillery assets inflict little damage on this deadly honeycomb of hidden machine gun nests and artillery emplacements. GIs on the ground must run a terrifying gauntlet of fire and steel as they move from bunker to bunker with hand grenades and flamethrowers. The 6th Division gains a foothold on the lower ridge of Mount Parkawagan just west of the Wawa, but their right flank can make no headway against the enemy's firepower on Mount Mataba. Unable to hold the line, The division gives up the ground they have just taken in order to mass their strength across a narrower front. The strategy pays off in a driving advance that forces a wedge into the Shimbu line, critically weakening its left flank. The slow and methodical attack absorbs the town of Antipolo, an important anchor of General Yokoyama's supply route, and deepens the salient threatening to split the Shimbu front. Casualties are heavy on both sides. Japanese totals are greater, due in part to a disastrous counteroffensive that dissolves almost as soon as it begins under the weight of American air and artillery strikes. Japanese units lose contact with one another and order disintegrates rapidly. The assault is so disorganized, the Americans don't even recognize that they are being attacked. U.S. officers describe the Shimbu group's intermittent actions as pockets of persistent infiltration by small units, never suspecting it is a single, coordinated offensive. General Yokoyama finally calls off the countering move in disgust after sustaining heavy losses. By 16 March, the 6th Army has turned Yokoyama's left flank far enough to clear an approach through the Bosa Bosa Valley northward to the Wawa Dam. In other action, the U.S. 40th Division lands without opposition at Panay, greeted by Filipino guerrillas who control much of the island. Only light resistance meets the American troops securing Iloilo, the Philippines' third largest city. As the ragged remnants of the small Japanese garrison withdraw into the mountains, no immediate pursuit is planned. Clearing Luzon and Panay are important steps in carrying out General MacArthur's ultimate goal, attacking the Japanese home islands from secure bases and staging areas in the Philippines. But every inch of ground gained in the Pacific exacts a heavy toll on American troops, who battle fatigue and disease as well as an intractable enemy. Strategically, victory in the Philippines seems just a matter of time, but for tired GIs, the only real certainty is the long, bloody struggle that an ever more desperate enemy will require in exchange. March 1945, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. Above the bustle of typewriters and ringing phones, a clerk exclaims, "Hot damn! We got a bridge over the Rhine and we're crossing over." In this manner, Schaeff gets the word that the tired GIs of Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division have captured the Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen after a daring daylight assault. In the days preceding the attack, the GI's General Omar Bradley pushed the troops of his American 12th Army Group hard toward the banks of the Rhine River. To the north, Major General William Simpson's 9th Army continued to support the plodding Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on his drive toward the Ruhr. With the 9th thus committed, Bradley ordered General Courtney Hodges, whose 1st Army had been holding the center of the Allied advance, to swing south and link up with 3rd Army and General George Patton, who were pushing northward along the Rhine's west bank. Bradley hoped this swift pincers movement would trap the 75,000 men of the German 15th Army on the wrong side of the Rhine and force them to capitulate before they could blow the remaining bridges. For this job, Hodges would have preferred to sling the most powerful dart from his quiver, Major General Lightning Joe Collins, but Collins' 7th Corps was badly depleted by the battle to take Cologne. Instead, Hodges was forced to rely on General John Milliken, commander of the 3rd Corps. When Milliken, a hard-charging pupil of Patton's, brought up the possibility of taking a bridge over the Rhine intact, Hodges scoffed at the idea, suggesting instead that any bridge would surely be destroyed by the Germans before U.S. forces could get anywhere near it. Undeterred, on 6 March, Milliken ordered the 9th Armored Division to proceed towards the lazy little hamlet of Stadt-Meckenheim, only 8 miles from the Rhine. In a wholly unexpected turn of events, the citizens of Stadt-Meckenheim greeted the Americans with white flags flying from every window. Pausing only to dine on a sumptuous meal of K-rations, the liberators of Stadt-Meckenheim began clearing roadblocks and beefing up their arsenal with captured enemy equipment before setting out in haste to the next objective, Remagen. As the armored spearhead approached a bluff overlooking the mighty Rhine, an ominous silence descended over the men. In the valley before them lay the ancient Roman town of Remagen, looking deceptively peaceful in the haze. Incredibly, beyond the town they could see the intact Ludendorff Bridge, choked with retreating Nazi soldiers and materiel. After a quick battlefield conference, the small group devised a daring plan to try to take the bridge. Under cover of tank fire and with bayonets fixed, a company of GIs charged down the hill and into Remagen. The defenders, a ragtag group of 1,100 Volkssturm, had also lost their taste for war. Only a handful remained at their posts. The rest fled at the first roar of approaching armor. The remaining defenders were horrified to discover that residents of Remagen were pointing out their positions to the Yanks. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, the holdouts finally retreated across the bridge after blowing a 30-foot crater in the approaches. As the Americans advanced, the retreating enemy began frantically trying to drop the bridge. Twice, German engineers tried to set off the charges they had left in place, but without success. On the third attempt, the charges detonated, but the bridge remained intact. Emboldened by the German failure and supported by new Pershing tanks, infantrymen dashed from girder to girder across the bridge, the ricocheting shells ringing in their ears. Within minutes, they had reached the far side and secured it, albeit tenuously. In desperate need of armor support on the east bank, repair work on the bridge and the crater begin immediately. American daring has produced a miracle, a foothold across the Rhine. As word of the miracle makes its way up the chain of command, many Allied generals are incredulous. Omar Bradley is so surprised that he disturbs Eisenhower at dinner to ask if he should exploit the victory. When Ike hears the news, he scraps months of careful planning, realizing that if the foothold is to be maintained, he must throw everything he has across the icy waters. Immediately, he orders 4 divisions to reinforce the delicate bridgehead. On 8 March, 8,000 men representing elements of the 9th, 78th, and 99th Infantry Divisions and the 9th Armored Division slog across the bridge and fan out in 3 directions. They cannot help but take note of the sign that greets them. Cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of the 9th Armored Division. It is of only brief comfort, however, as German artillery shells suddenly rain down near the bridge, and snipers fire upon stretcher-bearers as they carry the wounded to safety. The experience only sharpens the bitterness and determination of the GIs coming across. Heavy fighting quickly develops. The Americans repel bloody attack after bloody attack as they cling to their precious foothold. Field Marshal Walter Mödel, the Führer's precious fireman, commits 3 top-of-the-line divisions against the Yanks in an attempt to reduce the Allied foothold on the east bank. All assaults prove futile as the Americans cling tenaciously to their lucky prize. As precious fuel is exhausted and ammunition spent, Mödel has no choice but to suspend the attacks. A bitter stalemate ensues as confusion now commands the German army. In desperation, the Germans throw more than 300 planes at the bridge, only to meet the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft guns and howitzers in Europe. The Luftwaffe's aging Stukas take their place beside modern Me-262 jets in futile attempts to knock out the bridge. The Germans watch helplessly as the last of their pilots are spent in useless attacks. On 15 March, with 2 pontoon bridges constructed, the Ludendorff is closed to traffic so repairs can continue unabated. The cumulative effect of some 50,000 GI boots, the clanking of numerous tanks and countless attempts to destroy the structure has taken its toll. On 17 March, as repairs continue, the battered bridge finally collapses and falls into the swift current of the river below. Of the 200 men on the bridge, 63 are wounded, and 28 die in the cold, unforgiving waters of the Rhine. Every Allied soldier lost will be mourned, but the price of the Ludendorff Bridge has been small compared to the inestimable number of lives saved by the doorway its taking has opened into the heart of the fatherland. The Rhine has been crossed. Now, Ike is free to set his sights on the 300,000 Nazi troops defending Germany's industrial heartland and make his plans for final victory. Your letters made the difference at mail call today. Because of your letters, Tom, Frank, Anne, and hundreds of thousands of GIs and service personnel just like them all over the world know that someone still cares, still remembers, and that there's still a world back home worth fighting for. And because you sent your letters V-mail, those little morale boosters arrived in the shortest amount of time possible. V-mail is a wartime postal system operated jointly among the Army, Navy, U.S. Post Office Department, and Signal Corps. Through V-mail, all important letters from home reach the most outlandish destinations in less than 2 weeks. Obviously, this is no ordinary postal service. V-mail is a complex method designed to process tens of millions of overseas letters each month, and to drastically reduce their weight and bulk so that they can be transported to the front or to any far-off outpost by air. It works like this. First, write your letter on special one-page V-mail stationery. Remember to stay within the margins so that your entire message will reach its destination. When you finish, fold, seal, and deposit your letter in any post office or mailbox. It's that simple. Now the magic begins. What happens to a V-mail letter once it's in the mail depends on its ultimate destination. Generally, however, your overseas letter is delivered to a Signal Corps facility that photographs it for transport. But this is no ordinary photograph. This photograph is so small that your letter and thousands of others can be put on one very small roll of film called microfilm. One roll of microfilm weighs less than 7 ounces, occupies only 16 cubic inches of space, and holds up to 1,800 letters. If the military were to ship 150,000 ordinary one-sheet letters, that cargo would weigh more than 2,500 pounds and take up a large amount of valuable space that might otherwise be used to transport supplies for the troops. On microfilm, those same letters weigh only 45 pounds and take up much less space. This difference in size and mass means the difference between shipping by steerage or by air, the difference between your letter arriving months from now or days. The magic of V-mail continues when your letter reaches its destination. Signal Corps stations overseas print each letter onto 4x5-inch pieces of photographic paper that are much easier for the boys to carry in a pocket or backpack than bulky paper letters are. Once printed, letters are sorted by unit and delivered each day at mail call. When Johnny writes back to you, his letter goes through the same process as yours, with one exception. Don't mind the blacked-out words in his letter. Johnny didn't change his mind about what he wanted to say. Before his letters are microfilmed, they go through a military censor who makes sure Johnny isn't giving away any military secrets. Letters from home may be the best-kept secret weapon of the war. All over the globe today, our men and women in the armed forces, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest buck private, wait for reinforcements from you. Continue to do your part for the war. A letter a day, every day, till victory. March 1945, Mandalay. This once beautiful city of golden Buddhas has been reduced to smoldering rubble after weeks of bloody street-to-street fighting. British forces had closed like a fist around Mandalay in mid-March, but the Japanese were game for one last major battle in Burma. Their snipers vanished into the shell-pocked cityscape and awaited a flood of fresh targets. The Allied attackers did not disappoint them, charging enemy positions with machine guns blazing. Like everything else in the Allied Burma campaign, it was hot, treacherous work. The polyglot force of Indian, Gurkha, and African troops would once again distinguish themselves as the backbone of the British 14th Army, known within its ranks as the Forgotten Army. Always last on the list for precious supplies and reinforcements, the 14th has tackled the hardest jobs without the necessary tools or manpower. Now these hardened troops have at last come out of the jungles and are waging war in the fashion of their better-equipped comrades in Europe. Moving behind tanks and covered by fighter planes, the British Army's first objective in Mandalay was to take Pagoda Hill. The task was assigned to a battalion of Nepalese Gurkhas, among the toughest soldiers in this or any other war. Weaned on the rugged Himalayas, the Gurkhas had to blast their way up this smaller but no less formidable obstacle, the strategic high point of Mandalay. Pagoda Hill was so named for the maze of conical structures dotting its expanse. Built to honor Buddha, the temples served a decidedly irreligious purpose for enemy sharpshooters, particularly obstinate snipers, unreachable by infantry, were hammered by artillery, tanks, and dive bombers. After 3 days of fighting, the important vantage point was in Allied hands, and the Japanese had retreated to the confines of Fort Dufferin. General William Slim and his commanders were modern warriors faced with a medieval problem. Fort Dufferin had 26-foot high, 30-foot thick stone walls and a moat. Slim had artillery and bombs. In Mandalay, the clever tactics of deception and stealth that had kept the 14th Army alive throughout Burma had to be thrown out the window. The taking of Fort Dufferin came down to simply blowing up a wall with tons of explosives. Slim called in wave after wave of P-47 Thunderbolts, which could operate in the area with near impunity. After a week of trial and error and ear-splitting noise, the planes and artillery managed to open up a big, messy doorway. At first, it seemed Slim's men would not be able to reach that doorway, let alone cross its threshold. His infantry made 4 attempts at crossing the moat surrounding the fort, but found the well-armed Japanese to be less than receptive hosts. After one more day of bombardment, however, white flags appeared from within the fortress. The handful of shell-shocked prisoners turned out to be Burmese. The Japanese defenders had escaped through the fort's drainage system, leaving behind a smoking ruin and piles of dead bodies. Now there is nothing left to do but raise the British flag over the recaptured fort. Nearly 3 years of desperate fighting have passed since the Japanese took this colonial possession from the British, but there is little time to celebrate. Other concerns weigh heavily on the minds of Slim and his men. The Burma Area Army is doomed, but its remnants have slipped away into the jungles. More than 300 miles to the south, Rangoon is still occupied. Slim's imperative now is to race south along the Irrawaddy and Sitang rivers, mopping up the last vestiges of the enemy along the way. For this next mission, the Allies' worst enemy in Burma may be Burma itself. Monsoon season is about to begin, and the hope is Slim's troops can reach the sea at Rangoon before a sea of rain falls from the sky. March 1945, Berlin. Since the time of Attila the Hun, the threat of an overwhelming invasion from the east has haunted the German psyche. Now that national nightmare is coming true in the vast and savage incarnation of the Soviet Army. Despite the Wehrmacht's best efforts and despite fighting on German soil, the insatiable Russian Hydra, the red beast from the east, has consumed German soldiers and civilians alike, driving always westwards. The prize the Russians seek is Berlin. But Berlin is more than just a city to them. It is a lair a lair containing a monster that must be destroyed at all costs. And to date, that monster, Adolf Hitler, has thrown every man and weapon at his disposal into the path of the Soviet Colossus in vain attempts to stave off his now inevitable day of reckoning. Having failed to ensure victory by his generalship and having failed to keep the Allies at arm's length by sheer will, Hitler now turns the last vestiges of his power upon the one element over which he still maintains at least a nominal control: the German people. With the Americans and British driving hard for the Elbe and the Soviets within artillery distance of his chancellery, Hitler issues a scorched earth directive ostensibly designed to deny succor to the enemy. But the territory of the Reich has been irretrievably lost since January. To order such draconian measures now, with the war all but over, confirms what many have suspected for some time. The Führer is quite mad. When confronted by his Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, with the obvious repercussions this action will have on the German people, Hitler merely states that if indeed the war is lost, then the nation should also perish. Initially, Speer was Hitler's architect. Then his mission was to rebuild the victorious Reich in the gaudy, sterile image that his leader envisioned. Now that same leader has ordered him to be the architect of Germany's apocalypse. Speer cannot and will not be a party to such destruction. But it will take a whirlwind journey over the length and breadth of what remains of Nazi-controlled Germany to dissuade and persuade local political and military leaders to hold off instigating a national suicide. A glance at the daily situation confirms that Hitler's Reich is defending its last bastion. The German bridgehead over the Oder River at Altdam has been eliminated. Now, with the exception of a few scattered units around the Danzig area and the embattled defenders in the Courland pocket, no German soldiers are left east of the Oder. Finally, in a rare moment of lucidity, Der Führer dismisses the incompetent Heinrich Himmler from his post of commander, Army Group Vistula. As the supply trains roll day and night to Soviet forces on the Oder, it is only a matter of time before the curtain is ready to rise on the final act of the war in Europe. March 1945, the Pacific, as Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier force sails within 90 miles of the island of Kyushu. Experienced sailors throughout the fleet wait with taut nerves, bracing themselves for the possibility of kamikaze attacks. Each bears in mind the searing image of suicidal Japanese pilots inflamed with Bushido honor, going down in flames on the decks of American ships. Alert to the dangers surrounding them, Fifth Fleet's air and artillery support is crucial to the planned landing at Okinawa. Unlike similar assaults in the Philippines, there are no American bases within striking distance of this island, and until a base can be established on Okinawa, carriers will provide the only air cover for the fleet and its troops going ashore. American aircraft raiding Kyushu's airfields find hangars and barracks empty on the morning of 18 March. The planes they had hoped to catch napping on the ground are already laying course for Mitcher's Task Force 58. Hellcats and Corsairs pound the base anyway, hoping their own roosts will be more than smoking wreckage when they return. On this day, few kamikazes find their mark, but the fleet sustains some severe damage and numerous casualties. The kamikaze pilot with a one-way ticket to the deck of the Intrepid is cut down moments before he hits, but burning fragments tear into crewmen and ignite fires in the hangar deck. Yorktown escapes complete devastation when 2 Zeros headed for it miss their targets. A third manages to release a bomb that slams into the signal bridge and explodes below decks. Its nose bloodied, Task Force 58 licks its wounds and prepares for the next day's onslaught. The morning of the 19th, Task Force 58 takes a beating early. Just as the mess crew is preparing breakfast aboard the Wasp, a bomb penetrates the hangar deck, passes through the men's quarters, and explodes in the galley. 10 sailors are killed instantly and hundreds are wounded as able-bodied men fight to contain the fires breaking out on 5 decks. Their heroic efforts pay off. In only 15 minutes, the flames are out, and Wasp's flight deck continues air operations. Massing their attacks now, Zeros continue to swarm in the skies, releasing clusters of bombs or exploding in fiery trails as Yank gunners blast them into Emperor Hirohito's good graces. As terrifying as the kamikaze threat has become, it is the bomb that inflicts the worst damage on a carrier. Just as aircraft are preparing for a second strike in inland sea, the Franklin takes a direct hit. Its hangar deck and its forward elevator are wiped out. Minutes later, a second bomb smashes into the flight deck, spreading fires among the planes preparing to launch and destroying the aft elevator. When the conflagration reaches the stored ammunition and artillery aboard the aircraft, tremendous explosions rip the air. Ignited rockets skid down the deck toward crewmen attempting to control the fires. Soon the entire ship is engulfed in flames and black smoke, powerless and dipping its side ever closer to the turbulent surface of the sea. When all but key personnel are ordered to abandon ship, men drop into the water and wait to be rescued by nearby destroyers. Miraculously, the Franklin's captain and his skeleton crew manage to bring the fires under control, stabilize the ship's list, and transfer the wounded to the Santa Fe, which takes on over 800 men in 30 minutes. Over 700 sailors are killed aboard the Franklin and many more wounded. But these staggering casualties could have been even worse if not for the superior firefighting skills of Navy crewmen. Badly crippled, but still game, the ghost ship begins the long trip back to New York for repairs, the most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war. The success of the fast carrier raids speaks for itself. More than 3/4 of the Japanese aircraft committed to action were shot down, and unknown numbers were destroyed on the ground. This virtual annihilation of air power in the vicinity of Okinawa removes the threat of an aerial defense and gives American troops a much appreciated edge for the assault to come. When Johnny marches off to war, he may leave behind his weeping mother, his fond sister, his longing sweetheart or wife. The faces of these women linger sweetly in his memory as he stands watch on a rolling ship's deck in the Pacific, or pensively reflects on the next bomber mission. But in many cases, those gentle ladies to whom he bid farewell may not be as far behind as he thinks. They may, in fact, be as close as the steel hull of the ship on which he serves, or the riveted shell of the plane in which he flies. Women on the home front are answering their own recruitment call, pouring into the factories, shops, and service professions that keep the country running and its guns firing. Our boys overseas depend on American industry to supply them with everything from the uniforms they wear to the shells in their guns, and the gals back home are rolling them off the production lines in war-winning fashion. And if you're looking for the latest fashion trends, go no further than the nearest Boeing plant, steel mill, or Jeep assembly line. This season, smart headgear is definitely in. Bandanas, hard hats, and welders' masks meet the dual needs of function and, well, function. The modern riveter won't be seen anywhere without the latest in denim coveralls, and steel-toed boots never seem to go out of style. Most of the wartime jobs available to women can scarcely be described as glamorous. Heat, dirt, and oil are their lot, whether it's operating heavy machines, sifting gunpowder, or welding sheet metal. Working side by side with men, these plucky patriots punch their cards at the steel mills and the shipyards, sharing the labor as well as the hazards. Thousands of industrial deaths occur each year, and many more thousands are permanently disabled.
women face health risks posed by handling chemicals and explosives. Sometimes they receive very little or no training for their new jobs. But determined to be as brave as their counterparts on the front lines, you won't find much complaining on the assembly line. When the whistle blows, the day's work is not necessarily done. There are still families to feed, clothes to wash, and homes to clean. Many women pull double duty of this kind, their normal chores made even more tedious by waiting in long ration lines for meat, sugar, coffee, gas, and shoes. Nevertheless, such difficulties and privations are largely taken in stride. Experiencing life outside of the home and immediate family for perhaps the first time, these women discover a special kind of camaraderie with their fellow workers who come from many different backgrounds. They feel satisfaction from a job well done and pride at its completion. And unlike the long hours of toil put in at home, this work is rewarded with a paycheck. So Johnny, wherever your duty may take you, remember that the gals back home are doing their part to beat Hitler and Hirohito too. In your letters home, show your appreciation by writing those 5 little words that mean so much. Mom, thanks for the tank. March 1945, Iwo Jima, obedient to the Bushido Warriors Code, the last vestige of Japanese resistance, determined to earn the respect and esteem of emperor and ancestors by fighting to the death on the northeastern edge of this blood-soaked chunk of sulfurous rock. Dug deep into the side of Kitano Point, a few hundred of the Rising Sun's best, including their commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, continue to nip away at the occupying Americans who already have achieved their strategic objective. Navy Seabees are busily repairing and extending the runway on Iwo for their new function as a way station and repair yard for Air Corps B-29 superfortresses engaged in bombing runs over the Japanese home islands. When complete, the main runway will reach nearly 10,000 feet, longer than the island is wide at some points. Although the Marines who have fought on this sulfur-smelling rock will never think of a box of matches the same way again, Iwo is a gift for Allied strategists. Less than 700 miles from downtown Tokyo, it affords the mighty bombers' escorts a mere 3-hour flight to their targets. This is a far cry from the 10 or more hour journey separating Japan and the next nearest airbase in the Marianas. That Iwo should be both a godsend and a singularly god-forsaken slice of hell is a crowning irony in a war in which irony is common currency. At this stage of the fighting, divisional designations have become more or less irrelevant except in terms of marching orders. Few of the personnel on the island were here when the invasion started 5 weeks ago. Of the 30,000 Leathernecks who landed on Iwo on 19 February, 2/3 are dead or wounded. The collections of weary infantry and support troops answering to the names 3rd and 5th Marine Divisions have the thankless task of flushing out Kuribayashi's remaining tired and hungry defenders. The word firefight describes the action quite literally. Gallon upon gallon of flamethrower oil is spent on the Japanese resistance as hapless soldiers are cremated in their bunkers. Others watch helplessly as explosive charges are detonated at point-blank range. Even so, the Marines must proceed carefully. The wounded and the desperate often wrap themselves in dynamite awaiting the arrival of unlucky Marines, a final, honorable gesture for emperor and country. With their defeat sealed, on 26 March, the remaining Japanese emerge from their hiding places for a final, futile counterattack. For many of the Americans, it is the first time they have seen their nemesis alive since the assault began, if only briefly. It is also the first opportunity for the Allies to reap a significant bounty of prisoners. Kuribayashi is not among them, nor is his body found. The Axis commander is said to have committed suicide after being wounded in the anticlimactic final battle. Even now, however, the need for caution remains. There almost certainly are stragglers within the honeycomb of tunnels on Iwo. It will be necessary for the Yanks to keep a watchful eye for many more weeks. Iwo Jima is now firmly in American hands, but at a terrible price. 6,821 servicemen have given their lives, and 19,000 more have been wounded in the name of strategic necessity. Of the 24 battalion commanders to lead troops into battle on that fateful day in February, 19 are casualties of war. 3 full assault divisions of the elite Marine Force were reduced to but a shadow of their former strength. No battle in Marine Corps history has ever been so costly. Admiral Chester Nimitz told the assembled troops on 17 March, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." 22 March 1945, Oppenheim, Germany. With Allied forces poised to cross the Rhine, the war in Western Europe now enters a new phase: Armageddon. Through the ages, the swiftly flowing Rhine has served Germany well as the natural barrier to foreign invaders, but now it is little more than a starting line for the sprint to Berlin. To the south, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group hopes to make a series of quick crossings, taking the enemy by surprise. To the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery is ready to unleash Operation Plunder, the biggest Allied mobilization of men and materiel since D-Day. The two operations mirror the personalities of their commanders. Montgomery is the master of the grand set-piece assault, preferring to paint in broad, deadly strokes. Bradley is a shy, expedient general, content to capitalize on enemy mistakes. Since the disastrous Battle of the Bulge, in which Monty crowed about fixing Bradley's blunders, the two men have been fierce rivals. Bradley need not attempt to match Monty's egotistical flourishes, however. His bombastic subordinate, General George S. Patton, easily fills that role. Aware that Montgomery's boats will hit the water on 23 March, Patton tells his division commanders they can cross the Rhine anytime they want, as long as it's now. Boats and engineering equipment are hustled from depots in the rear, and General Leroy Irwin's 5th Division is tapped to lead the assault. As the 90th Division begins phony preparations for a major crossing at Mainz, the 5th sneaks across the Rhine upstream at Oppenheim. Neither the lack of planning nor the feeble German resistance hinders the operation. Regardless of the real motivations behind Patton's early crossing, its most immediate effect is to catch the enemy with his pants down. The German 7th Army, depleted from the fighting west of the river, has barely had time to assess its own strength before the Americans start pouring over the Rhine. There are little more than handheld weapons available to repel the Third Army, and the hands holding them are often too young, too old, or too infirm to make effective use of them. The first waves of American assault boats quickly give way to amphibious vehicles loaded with reinforcements. The 5th Division's bridgehead soon extends for miles, and Bradley begins shouting from the rooftops and to the press that Patton has managed to sneak across the river. Just as news of the surprise assault comes to light, Montgomery's Operation Plunder starts with a bang. The 21st Army Group conjures a hellstorm of artillery fire at several points along the river. By the time the first assault boats land on the east bank of the Rhine near Wesel, the German defenders have been pummeled into near submission. Monty has incredible might at his disposal, a force of well over 1 million men and hundreds of thousands of tons of equipment. In addition to British and Canadian forces, the American 9th Army also participates in the assault, bringing the total number of Allied divisions to 29. Montgomery leaves nothing to chance. After overplaying his hand in Operation Market Garden the previous October, the British Field Marshal is now playing his cards close to his chest. Despite the high probability of simply rolling over the thin German resistance, Operation Plunder has an insurance policy in the airborne Operation Varsity. Instead of deploying paratroops before the assault, Monty waits until the first waves of the main force get across the river, then drops 2 airborne divisions just behind enemy lines. The paratroopers make a harrowing descent through the flak-filled skies, only to find themselves in the enemy's crosshairs when they land. Despite heavy losses, the airborne troops succeed in destroying much of the German artillery and take 3,500 prisoners. Winston Churchill, on hand to witness the crossing, is invigorated by the rousing success of Operation Plunder. "The German is whipped. We've got him. He is all through," Churchill tells Eisenhower as they watch their countrymen swarm across the Rhine. The Prime Minister even convinces Monty to take him to the east bank of the river shortly after it is secured. Patton discovers his son-in-law may be in a POW camp some 35 miles behind enemy lines. Despite the risk, Patton sends a task force into Hammelburg on 26 March to liberate the camp. The mission of mercy quickly becomes a fiasco as tanks from the 4th Armored Division are cut off and torn to shreds. Most of the troops sent to rescue POWs become prisoners themselves. Patton soon hangs the blame on just about everybody involved in the raid, except himself. Bradley and Ike allow Patton's folly to blow over, however, and keep the world's attention focused on the rousing success of the Rhine crossings. The end game is at hand, and they will need all their best commanders, impetuous or otherwise, to drive a stake into the heart of the Third Reich. March 1945, Kerama Islands. At dawn, amphibious tractors bearing the 77th Division litter the beaches of 8 tiny islands off the coast of Okinawa, with orders to plant Old Glory on each one and make it stick. Offshore, the USS Arkansas provides a covering bombardment in expectation of the usual Japanese welcoming committee. Fortune appears to have smiled on the GIs, however. Opposition is only token, and the most difficult chore for most of the Americans is dealing with the terrified civilian population. Perhaps the Japanese know this mini-invasion is only a prelude. The Yanks have their sights set on the shiny jewel of Okinawa, a mere 350 miles from the Japanese mainland and the first of the Emperor's possessions to fall into real jeopardy. Vice Admiral Kelly Turner wants the Kerama's deep-water anchorage for refueling and resupply of his Okinawa invasion fleet. In a bit of high-level horse trading, Turner got Admiral Raymond Spruance and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner to accede to his Kerama's plan by agreeing to attack Okinawa from the north rather than at its southern beach. Turner's bargain pays off. Immediately, supply craft begin shuttling ammunition and supplies to the big boats in the anchorage's calm. The Americans get an unexpected bonus when they find more than 350 of the enemy's fragile suicide boats hidden away in caves along the shoreline. Apparently, the Japanese were too busy digging holes to consider that the Allies might look here. At its conception, the aim of the invasion of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, really was twofold. Apart from the obvious intent of acquiring a staging area from which to mount an invasion of Japan itself, the mission also would sever the vital supply route from Borneo, Sumatra, and Burma for the fuel-starved and sputtering empire. The Yankees assemble a formidable naval force. Spruance's Fifth Fleet includes more than 400 assault ships and nearly 1,100 support vessels, many of which have been on the job since mid-February, pummeling Okinawa with the explosive calling cards of the advancing Allies. Carrier-based planes also have been performing reconnaissance on Okinawa's defenses as they sought their targets. Spruance, Turner, and Buckner intend to leave as little as possible to chance. Unfortunately, most of the aerial photography has produced inconclusive pictures. Constant cloud cover obscures the southern half of the island, where both the Japanese army and local conscripts are thought to be digging the now familiar reinforced entrenchments. The invasion force will have to play a large part of this tune by ear. What's more, Admiral Chester Nimitz has agreed to undertake the invasion with only the forces already available to him: 3 Marine and 4 Army divisions. The Marines have been training at Guadalcanal, enduring nearly as much misery from heat and insects as from the exercises themselves. The Army units have just returned from their first R&R in over 3 months, but no one begrudges them their brief respite. Their last assignment was the fetid expanse of Leyte. Noticeably absent is any vestige of support from the Japanese homeland. Task Force 58 under Mark Mitcher is adding to its reputation as a quick, mobile engine of destruction as it batters the enemy airfields on Kyushu, rendering Admiral Matome Ogaki's 5th Air Fleet mostly theoretical. Since Japanese naval power has likewise been reduced to a few choruses of thanks for the memories, the waters near the potential landing sites have been mined. Crews worked gingerly to remove the barriers, mostly without incident. On 31 March, just hours before L Day, the 77th adds one more item to the shopping cart. Tiny Kaisushima, worthless to the Japanese but a useful prize for the Americans, lies between the Karamas and Okinawa's southern end and will serve as a home for a 155mm long Tom cannon installation. From here, island defenses can be targeted during what stands to be the most difficult part of the mission. Along with the Navy, the 77th has done its job. Tomorrow, Easter Sunday, American soldiers will storm the beaches of Okinawa, hoping that this time next year they'll be hunting Easter eggs and chocolate bunnies instead of desperate and dangerous Japanese troops. March 1945, Japan. American bombers in the Pacific dealt the rising Sun Empire a terrible blow this month, destroying large parts of 4 major cities on the Japanese home island, killing thousands. In 5 raids, Major General Curtis LeMay's 21st Bomber Command has destroyed almost 32 square miles of Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, terrorizing the civilian populations. The Japanese' worst fears about the vulnerability of their cities have come true in the wake of 10 days of non-stop incendiary bombings. LeMay's successful campaign is another milestone in the short history of the Army Air Corps. It is perhaps the greatest victory since the nation's fledgling air branch finally flew off on its own. In Europe, American bombers fell under the control of Army commanders who used them primarily in support of ground troops. In the first half of 1944, American B-17s and B-24s spent much of their time on bombing missions designed to mislead the Germans about the site of the coming Allied invasion. After D-Day, as Allied ground forces pushed across France, bombers played a mostly subordinate role. From President Roosevelt and Congress on down, Americans opposed the concept of their planes carrying out unprovoked, promiscuous, or indiscriminate attacks against another nation's citizenry. So while the Luftwaffe and the RAF had for a time bombed each other's cities with varying degrees of success, the U.S. Army Air Corps confined itself to what it called precision bombing. Always done in daylight, precision bombing targeted the German industrial web in an effort to destroy key elements of Germany's war manufacturing capabilities. Targets were chosen for their critical products or roles, and for how hard it would be for the Germans to replace them. Unfortunately, the Americans discovered that precision bombing was not particularly effective, nor was it all that precise. The Germans always seemed to recover from the repeated bombings of their transportation, oil, and aircraft manufacturing facilities. By August 1944, the Americans began to rethink their bombing policies. Eisenhower told 8th Air Force Commander Major General Karl Spaatz that, "While I have always insisted that the U.S. strategic air forces be directed against precision targets, I am always prepared to take part in anything that gives real promise to ending the war quickly." Still, the Americans resisted British proposals for terror bombing of German civilians. Instead, they rededicated themselves to striking hard at strategic targets, especially German oil production and transportation. These attacks in the fall of 1944 were more systematic and more effective, and they began to shut down the extraordinary German war machine. In February, the Americans joined the British in bombing the German city of Dresden, killing, by some estimates, more than 100,000 civilians. Public outcry failed to persuade American leaders to back away from their new bombing policy. The attack on Dresden was perhaps a prelude to the strategic bombing of Japan. General LeMay, whose 21st Bomber Command is part of the uniquely independent 20th Air Force, answers only to the Chief of the Army Air Corps, General Henry Hap Arnold. LeMay is a veteran of the B-17 campaigns against the Germans, as well as precision strikes against Japanese factories in the Far East. LeMay's B-29 Superfortresses are capable of flying longer distances and carrying heavier bomb loads, and now he has loosed them on Japanese cities built of wood and paper, targets much more vulnerable than the fortified German cities. Each time LeMay's bombers make a run on the Japanese home islands, they leave fire and devastation in their wake. Some of Japan's more important cities are reduced to smoke and ash. Now, LeMay has begun to believe that one of the founding fathers of the American Air Forces, General Billy Mitchell, was correct in his belief that wars can be won by extensive bombing of an enemy's key cities and civilian populations. With this month's raids, the Army Air Corps has proved the power of the strategic air arm. Now, for the first time, LeMay hopes, Eisenhower and his staff can see how a war, this war, might be won through bombing alone.
March 1945, Central Europe. With the life of the Third Reich only one turn of the vice from being extinguished, cracks are beginning to appear in the solidarity of the Grand Alliance. Surprisingly enough, it is the Anglo-American faction that is having its differences. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower has telegraphed Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, informing him that the Western Allies' intentions are not directed towards Berlin. This sends British Prime Minister Winston Churchill into a fury. Churchill, who believes that as coalition warfare draws to an end, political considerations have mounting importance, mistrusts Uncle Joe and fears a post-war Europe dominated by the Soviets. Additionally, he accuses Ike of overstepping his authority and communicating his strategic intentions directly to a head of state. Eisenhower retorts that Stalin is also commander-in-chief of the Red Army. By informing Stalin of his decision, Ike hopes to coordinate the crushing of any Wehrmacht resistance and avoid any friendly fire incidents between the Eastern and Western Allies. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler, sequestered 40 feet below the gardens of the Reichschancellery, still attempts to exert some type of strategic influence on the war. Chief of the German General Staff, General Heinz Guderian, has for the better part of his tenure attempted to moderate Hitler's more asinine orders. Guderian knows that static defenses and sheer will are no substitute for good defensive ground and mobile forces. Now, even with his best generals forced to give ground, Hitler still refuses to see his war is lost. Instead, he heaps scorn upon the general staff he feels has failed him. Hitler relieves Guderian
ostensibly for health reasons, and in his place appoints General Hans Krebs. Actions on the other side of the Eastern Front suggest changes in the wind for the Russians as well. In a foreshadowing of things possibly to come, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov announces to the Japanese ambassador to Moscow that the Soviet Union does not intend to renew its non-aggression treaty of 1941. This notification, a full year before the agreement is due to expire, bodes ill for the Japanese. According to the Yalta agreements, the Soviet Union must enter the war against Japan within 2 months after the conclusion of the European conflict. With Germany in its death throes, Uncle Joe Stalin is putting the Japanese on notice. Surrender or else. Every fighting man must overcome intimidating obstacles on his way to victory. Some of them are personal. He must conquer his own fear and learn the skills that will keep him and his fellows alive on the fields of battle. Sometimes those obstacles are more concrete and tactical. A river that must be crossed, a hill that must be taken, a target that must be hit from above when the very air explodes in bursting fire around him. Every soldier expects to confront these challenges sooner or later. But there is one special group of men who had to fight a war at home before they ever saw combat overseas. These courageous few are the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group. Never before have black pilots served in the armed forces, but the splendid reputation they have acquired in the skies over North Africa, Sicily, and the Mediterranean have changed that forever. If the key to victory is overcoming obstacles, then the success of the 332nd should come as a surprise to no one. In 1941, activists and black leaders appealed to the courts to end Jim Crow segregation and allow young black men the opportunity to become pilots. The War Department formed the 99th Pursuit Squadron to be trained at the Army Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, near the site of Booker T. Washington's famous Tuskegee Institute. The school had already established a civil aviation branch, and it was quickly converted for military use. The plan was met with scorn from many white military and political leaders who thought the experiment would merely prove the inadequacy of blacks to become flyers. Such ridiculous theories were soon put to rest by confident cadets who came from all over America to join the program. One of the first to enroll was Captain Benjamin Davis, the first black cadet in 47 years to graduate from West Point. He was among the first Tuskegee class of 5 pilots to gain their wings and went on to command the 99th Squadron after his promotion to lieutenant colonel. Still, there were many detractors. Critics believed that the black pilots would never be accepted by their white counterparts. But by the summer of 1943, the squadron was stationed in Italy and flying missions as bomber escort fighters. Since June 1944, when the 99th joined with 3 other Tuskegee squadrons to form the 332nd Fighter Group, they have become famous enough to win epithets from friend and foe alike. The Germans call them Schwarze Vogelmännchen, the Black Birdmen. Fellow white airmen call them the Black Red-Tailed Angels, from both the distinguishing markings on their Mustangs and their record of never having lost a single bomber escorted by their squadrons. Tuskegee Airmen have destroyed over 200 enemy aircraft thus far in the war and flown thousands of sorties. In March 1945, Colonel Davis led a squadron of 72 P-51s from their base in Italy on a bomber escort mission destined for Berlin. Because of the distance, a second squadron should have relieved them for the final leg of the journey, but the relief never came. Despite being low on fuel and facing the prospect of engaging the superior German Me-262 jet fighters, Davis Group continued on to the target. In the ensuing dogfight, the Red-Tailed Angels shot down 3 jets and lost 2 of their P-51s. but the mission was successfully completed. For their skill and valor, the 332nd received a Distinguished Unit citation. What better example of loyalty and sacrifice can be found than these men, willing to risk everything in defense of a country whose shortcomings they know all too well? Whatever awards may come their way, it will be difficult to adequately honor these brave pioneers for the respect they have earned, not just for themselves, but for the generations which will follow them. More than any other black fighting unit, it is perhaps their example that will pave the way toward the end of segregation in the American Armed Forces. March 1945, the Southwest Pacific. Operation Victor II rolls into action as American troops land on the beaches of Cebu Island, driving forward General Douglas MacArthur's plan to rid the beleaguered Philippines of their Japanese aggressors. The first elements of the Americal Division land without incident at Talisay, following a routine bombardment by American cruisers and destroyers. But what at first promises to be a carefree day at the beach quickly turns to chaos. Exploding mines kill and wound advancing soldiers and destroy 10 of the first 15 arriving tanks. Based on intelligence from Filipino guerrillas, American engineers expected the beaches to be mined. What they were not expecting was that the mines would be planted so deeply that the naval bombardment would fail to detonate them. As succeeding waves of landing craft arrive, men and equipment jam the shoreline, unable to move forward. Engineers scramble to disarm the devices and map a path through the treacherous sands. As the marooned Americans wait at water's edge, they have one person especially to thank that they are not annihilated where they stand: the author of the latest Japanese defensive tactics. Imperial Command's felicitous new tactical policy of abandoning beachheads for inland defenses saves the Americans bacon. If their forward defensive positions were manned, the Japanese might have thrown the Americans back into the sea like an undersized fish. At the very least, they might have forced the Yanks into a costly frontal assault. But for now, fate seems to have smiled on the Americans. As the GIs move cautiously inland toward Cebu City, they pass abandoned pillboxes and artillery installations that might have been used to write their death warrants. Instead, they stand empty and harmless in the glare of a tropical sun. Even with the delay at the beaches, American infantry enters the city unopposed just one day after landing. The next objectives on Cebu are the metropolitan water sources to the west and the Lahug airstrip to the north. Once the surrounding hills are cleared of the remaining Japanese, engineers will begin to work on a base for Allied flyers. Meanwhile, on Luzon, fighting continues along the Shimbu line. American forces drive General Shitsuo Yokoyama's left flank further eastward, clearing the approaches to the Wawa and Ipo dams. Casualties continue to mount in this bitter struggle. The uninterrupted combat wears on the hearts, minds, and bodies of exhausted soldiers on both sides. Disease is rampant. Small wounds lead to lingering, festering sores. Units are sapped to mere shadows of their former selves. The Japanese, in particular, are in dire straits. With their supply lines severed, they find themselves completely isolated in the rugged environment. In addition, the Americans, with their superior firepower, are inflicting casualties at a rate of 6 to 1. Further action on Cebu and throughout the southern islands will doubtlessly reflect the general pattern of fighting on Luzon. Refusing to bow to the inevitable, Japanese troops retreat to defensive ground, dig in, and fight ferociously to the end. It is an end, perhaps, to be illumined only by the last feeble rays of the rising sun. 28 March 1945, Danzig. The city where the opening shots of the Second World War were fired over 5.5 years ago falls prey to the Soviet steamroller as troops of the Second Byelorussian Front under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky enter this Baltic port. German resistance, heretofore fanatical, now approaches the realm of the superhuman. Soldiers push themselves and their machines beyond endurance in the futile attempt to stem the Soviet colossus. German tactics and technology make themselves felt time and again as Soviet penetrations are sealed off and destroyed. Despite these horrendous losses, the Russian advance continues. Nevertheless, the sacrifice of the Wehrmacht is not totally in vain. In his Berlin bunker, Hitler and his retinue still cling to the delusion of victory. The common German soldier's reason to fight on is far less grandiose and far more intimate. Since the beginning of the war, segments of the civilian population of Europe have been on the move, displaced by battle or merely trying to avoid the crushing heel of Hitler's new order. Now the frightened figures furtively fleeing are German. Stalked by Russian forces, these refugees know that mercy and compassion are in short supply should they fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. Their only hope lies in reaching the coast and evacuation. Shielding them is the Wehrmacht's prime, if unofficial, mission. Thanks to propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, German soldiers have seen the price civilians pay when liberated by the Russians. Unspeakable atrocities committed by troops whose hearts and minds have been filled with their own propaganda machines call for extracting the last ounce of revenge from anything German. The Wehrmacht achieves a measure of success as many refugees find safety on ships sailing from Baltic ports. But success for some is cold comfort to others too slow or too unfortunate to avoid capture. By 30 March, German units east of the Oder are forced into tighter and tighter perimeters until exhaustion, lack of ammunition, and sheer Soviet numbers finally overwhelm them. Some opt for surrender, while others make a determined last stand, giving the last full measure for Volk, Reich, and Führer. In the south, the failure of Hitler's Spring Awakening offensive in Hungary has allowed the Soviets to counterattack with a renewed vigor that doomed General Otto Wehler's Army Group South to an incessant retreat to avoid annihilation. By 2 April, advanced Soviet units reached Neusiedler Lake, bordering Austria. The former crack SS divisions guarding the approaches to Vienna now are cracked units, retaining only traces of their former strength and elan. 2 days later, the last German troops are evicted from Hungary. Hitler's ideological supermen finally have discovered what their less enlightened, mere mortal Wehrmacht brethren have known for quite some time. For a moment, the resolve of the Russian bear may be dimmed, but it is never fully extinguished.
When history reflects upon the epic struggle known as World War II, it will note the political savvy of Roosevelt, the strategic brilliance of Eisenhower, Patton's boldness, and MacArthur's dogged determination. Lost in the praise of these great men who helped shepherd the free world through the trials of global conflict will be the true hero of this war, G.I. Joe. He is the common soldier, sailor, or airman. Did not ask to be thrown into this tempest of blood and violence. His heart is at home with his family and friends, yet when fate pressed upon him the most difficult of situations, the most trying of circumstances, his indomitable spirit never ceased to carry the day. 1941 found him an innocent young man from small-town USA. The war in Europe and Asia was a distant affair of little consequence to his daily life. Glenn Miller's latest release or where to take his best girl on Saturday night were uppermost in his mind, far more important than the evils of fascism. Pearl Harbor brought that world of wide-eyed innocence crashing down around him. Seemingly overnight, the rigors of boot camp became his reality. Loaded on a train and shipped halfway across the country, he was forced to eat, sleep, and train with men whose customs, not to mention accents, seemed strangely foreign. His heart, not for the last time, ached for the familiar comfort of home. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to change. His step was sharper, more self-assured, his posture upright and eyes alert, and gradually he and those men who at first seemed so foreign became a cohesive unit. Full of confidence in himself, his buddies, and his mission, he boarded troop ships bound for honor and glory, certain he would do his part in driving back the forces of tyranny around the globe. Upon reaching those foreign shores, any and all notions he had about the glory of war were abruptly shattered. Combat situations that weeks earlier were nothing more than training exercises were now matters of life and death. Men who a few short months earlier he regarded as peculiar strangers, he now began to consider brothers. The mere physical demands of combat forced him to lengths he never thought possible. Forced marches for days on end, frigid cold, insufferable heat, frostbite, malaria, and a myriad of other discomforts. These were the conditions he was forced to endure. Still, he drove onward. Far worse than the physical stresses were the emotional ones. This man, who not so long ago was an innocent boy, soon found himself charged with the daily task of killing other men. Day after day, he watched as his newfound brothers' bodies were mangled by landmines or the bursts of flak shells. He held them in his arms as he watched the life drain from their bodies, promising to get in touch with their loved ones back in the States. His mind raced with endless questions. Would he be next? Would he ever see his family again? Would his girl back home be true? Would this damned war ever end? Still, something deep inside made him look beyond these questions and complete the task at hand. Now, 4 years later, the vicious reality of war has taken away his youth. Never again will he be the naive, wide-eyed boy he once was. He has seen too much. His innocence has been replaced with a sense of melancholy and steely determination. The debt of gratitude owed this man by the entire free world can never be repaid. The sacrifices he has made have not been in vain. His boundless courage and selfless devotion to duty have served, once again, to free the world from the yoke of oppression.